The weight of endless deadlines and the constant noise of the world can make your mind feel like a runaway train, leaving you exhausted but unable to rest. Turning to dark stories gives your brain a strange, comforting boundary, a safe container where you can finally pause your own worries and let your nervous system reset. When the day demands too much, a quiet tale allows you to let go. Welcome back, friends. I'm Dev, and this is True Horror Stories Film. I am staying up with you tonight to make sure your space remains a sanctuary. If you are looking for a place to unwind, please subscribe, leave a like, and share in the comments what kind of burnout or stress you are escaping from tonight. You are safe here. Now let us begin together. Hey, come sit with me for a little while. Whatever today cost you, you can set it down now, right here, before we go any further. You have done enough for one day. What I have for you tonight moves slow, and it asks for patience. So let your shoulders drop and let your breathing slow to match it. I will take care of the rest. There is a stretch of Route 61 outside Centralia, where my truck's cabin thermometer reads 4 degrees warmer than the air around it. Every single time, regardless of season, I have stopped trying to explain the discrepancy to the state. I have not stopped driving that stretch. Something under that road knows my name, and I no longer understand how it learned it. I inspected condemned ground for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, specifically the kind of ground that used to hold up a town before something started eating it from underneath. Gas readings, subsidence mapping, structural risk assessments on the handful of buildings still standing in places most people had agreed on paper no longer existed. I was good at it. I want you to know that first, before anything else, because it matters later. I was good at reading ground that was trying to kill people slowly, and I trusted my instruments the way other men trust their fathers. That comparison is not an accident. I am getting to him. Before I tell you what happened in Centralia last winter, I need you to understand what the town actually is, because most people know it only as a rumor, the inspiration for a video game. A headline that gets recycled every few years with a photograph of smoke rising out of a crack in an empty road. What it actually is a fire. A real one, still burning, that started in 1962 in an old strip mine pit that the town used as a trash dump, and that fire found its way down into the abandoned coal seams underneath the borough, and has been burning there ever since. Low and patient and enormous, spread now across roughly 400 acres, with enough coal left to keep it fed for the next several centuries if nothing stops it, and nothing has yet. By the 1980s, the ground was venting carbon monoxide into basements. A boy nearly died when a sinkhole opened under his backyard and swallowed him to his armpits. Steam pouring off him, the earth trying to take him down into itself, the way it had taken everything else. The federal government spent tens of millions of dollars relocating almost everyone. The post office revoked the zip code in the early 2000s. Legally, officially, on every map that matters to a government, Centralia does not exist anymore. But a handful of people never left. My father was one of them. I grew up in Centralia before the evacuation, in a house 2 streets over from where the fire first broke the surface. And I remember what the town smelled like before it started smelling like sulfur, which is to say I remember very little, because I was young, and children do not catalog the ordinary. What I remember clearly is later. I remember being 19 years old and driving my father to a relocation office in Ashland with a folder of paperwork he refused to sign, watching him fold his arms and say, calmly, that this was his house, and no fire was going to write him a check for it. I remember thinking at 19 that this was stubbornness, plain and simple, the kind you could argue a man out of if you were patient enough. I was not patient enough, not forever. For a long stretch of years I tried. I drove up from where I lived, brought him documentation about gas levels, showed him readings from state inspectors who were not yet me, sat across his kitchen table while steam rose off frozen ground visible through his window, and told him the numbers did not lie. He would nod and thank me for caring, and tell me he had lived through worse winters than this one, which was true and irrelevant, and he knew it was irrelevant, and did it anyway. Somewhere in my late 20s, I stopped making the drive as often. I told myself it was his choice to make, and I was old enough to respect it. That is a true sentence. It is also not the whole sentence. The rest of it is that the drive was 2 hours each way, and the conversation never changed. And I had gotten tired of losing the same argument on a schedule, so I let 2 years pass with visits I could count on one hand, phone calls that got shorter, a version of respect that looked, from a certain angle, exactly like giving up on him. He died in his house in the condemned zone 11 months ago, alone in February, and the coroner's best estimate placed it 3 days before anyone found him. I was not the one who found him. A retired power company lineman named Gerald Hutchins found him, a neighbor from 2 streets over, one of the other 5 or 6 holdouts who still lived inside the buffer zone that year, and Gerald called it in. And I got the call from a number I did not recognize while I was standing in a Commonwealth office in Harrisburg reviewing subsidence maps for a stretch of ground 40 miles from the only ground that had ever actually mattered to me. I requested the Centralia assignment 9 months later. I want to tell you I did it out of love. I did it because I could not stop thinking about the ground he died on, and some part of me, the part that still believed instruments over feelings, thought that if I understood the chemistry well enough, I could make peace with the fact that I was not there. That is who I was when I drove into the buffer zone last December, 4 days before Christmas, to conduct the annual subsidence survey on the parcels still occupied. The road into Centralia from the south runs through country that looks, at first, like any other stretch of rural Pennsylvania in winter. Ridge lines dark with bare trees, fields gone the color of old rope, a sky the flat white of a fluorescent light left on too long. Then the smell arrives before anything else does. Sulfur and something under the sulfur that I have never been able to name precisely, mineral and faintly sweet, like a struck match held too close to a penny. It comes through the vents of a sealed truck cabin. It gets into wool coats and stays there through 3 washes. My father's flannel jacket, which I kept, still carries a trace of it, even now, even after 11 months in a closet 200 miles away. And some nights I take it out and hold it up to my face just to check, and it is always still there. The road itself is where I first noticed the thermometer. My truck has a cabin display that reads outside air temperature, a small green digital number pulled from a sensor mounted near the front grille. Nothing sophisticated, the kind of feature every modern vehicle carries, without anyone thinking twice about it. On the stretch of Route 61 that runs closest to the old strip mine pit where the fire began, that number reads warmer than it should, consistently by 3 or 4 degrees, for a span of maybe half a mile. I noticed it that first afternoon because the display read 31 degrees, and my hands, resting on the wheel, could feel that the truth outside was colder than that, could feel it in the particular ache cold puts in knuckles that have driven through a lot of winters. I assumed a sensor fault. I made a note to have it checked. I did not have it checked. Not that trip, not the next one. And by the third trip I had stopped assuming anything, because the number was always exactly, precisely warm in that same half mile, never anywhere else on the drive, rain or clear, morning or evening, as though the ground itself were breathing warmth up through frozen asphalt, and my truck was simply the only one honest enough to say so. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, and I built my entire career on the belief that things which sound like ghost stories usually have chemistry underneath them. So let me give you the chemistry first, the way I gave it to myself. Underground coal fires do produce measurable surface warming. Snow melts in patterns above active seams. Steam vents through fissures where gas pressure finds a weak point in the rock. None of what I am about to tell you required anything supernatural to begin. I want that on the record because it makes what happened worse, not better. The way it is worse to be betrayed by something you trusted your whole life than by a stranger you never believed in to begin with. My first 2 days in the buffer zone were routine. I mapped gas readings around the 4 remaining occupied structures, walked the fence lines the state maintains around the worst subsidence zones, filed nothing unusual. I stayed each night at a motel in Mount Carmel, 20 minutes south, because nobody, not even the Commonwealth, expects an inspector to sleep inside a town that is actively on fire underneath itself. On the 3rd day, Gerald Hutchins invited me in for coffee, the same Gerald who had found my father, and I said yes before I had fully decided to, because some part of me had been circling that conversation since the funeral and had never found the nerve to have it on purpose. Gerald's kitchen was warm in the particular overheated way of old men living alone in old houses, and he poured coffee into a mug that said "World's Best Grandpa" cracked along the handle, and he did not make me ask. He told me gently, the way you tell a man something you have rehearsed, because you knew eventually he would come and want it told to him properly. He said my father had been in good spirits that week, had come by twice to trade firewood for eggs, had mentioned me by name, unprompted, said he was proud that I had gone into the same kind of work that had, in Gerald's words, taken his house, but not his son. I asked what he meant by that. Gerald said my father used to tell people I understood the ground better than any of the state boys who came through, because I had grown up smelling it, and that this was, to him, a kind of inheritance he was glad to have passed on, even if the house went with it. I did not cry in Gerald's kitchen. I want you to know that, not because it matters to the story, but because it matters to me, that I held it together long enough to finish the coffee, and thank him and walk back out into the cold, like a professional. I cried in the truck 20 minutes later, in the cabin that read 4 degrees warmer than the world outside its windows. And I do not know how long I sat there before I noticed that the warm patch of road had somehow followed me, that I was parked a full quarter mile from where I had first clocked the anomaly, and the thermometer still read warm. That was the first small thing. There would be others. I want to walk you through them the way I lived them, one at a time, each one small enough on its own to explain away, the way I explained each one away in the moment, because that is the truth of how a person loses their footing on ground like this. Not all at once, a degree at a time. The second thing happened on the fourth day, at a fissure the locals call the throat, a crack in the earth roughly 11 feet long and narrow enough in most places to step over, located on an unmarked parcel, behind what used to be the town's old cemetery, itself still tended, still visited, one of the only pieces of Centralia the fire has not yet reached. Gerald had mentioned it in passing, almost as an afterthought. The way people mention things they have decided long ago not to think about too hard. He said the old-timers, the ones from before the evacuation, used to say the throat breathed on the coldest nights, that you could stand near it in January and feel warm air moving up, out of the crack in slow even pulls, in and out, like something enormous sleeping just under the rock. He said his own father used to warn him never to cross it after dark, not because of the gas, though the gas was real too, but because of something else the old-timers never quite named, only warned about. The way you warn a child away from deep water without explaining exactly what drowning feels like. I went to survey the throat because it was on my list, one of the last unmapped fissures in the eastern section of the buffer zone, and my job was to measure its gas output and structural risk. Nothing more. I brought a portable meter, standard equipment, and I knelt at the edge of the crack, in the last gray light of a December afternoon, and lowered the sensor down into it on its cable. And the meter read elevated carbon monoxide, elevated sulfur dioxide, numbers well within the range I would have predicted for an active vent of that size. Routine. I was packing the meter away when I heard it breathe. I want to be exact about what I mean by that word, because I did not mean it figuratively at the time, and I do not mean it figuratively now. There was a sound, low, and it came from inside the fissure, a long inhale of air being drawn downward, followed, after a pause of maybe 4 seconds, by a slower exhale that pushed warm air up past my kneeling face, warm enough that I felt it on my eyelids, warm enough that for one disoriented moment I thought someone was standing directly behind me, breathing over my shoulder. I turned. There was no one there. There was only the cemetery and the tree line beyond it and the flat white sky going the color of a healing bruise as the light failed. I told myself it was pressure venting through an irregular channel, gas finding a wider opening and narrowing, a completely explainable acoustic phenomenon that any geologist could account for in 5 sentences or fewer. I wrote that explanation in my field notes. I believed roughly half of it while I was writing it. That night, back at the motel in Mount Carmel, I lay awake a long time listening to the heater cycle on and off, and somewhere in that stretch of not sleeping, I found myself doing something I have not done since I was a boy, running through the exact floor plan of my father's house in my mind, room by room, the crack in the plaster above the bathroom door, the particular creak of the third stair, the smell of his coffee can, full of nails on the workbench in the garage. It was not comforting, exactly. It was the mind reaching for something solid and small to hold on to while something much larger sat unexamined in the dark beside it. I fell asleep somewhere in the kitchen of that remembered house, and I do not remember dreaming, and I woke before my alarm with a particular ache behind my eyes that comes from crying in your sleep without waking up for it. Here is the part of this story where I have to tell you about the sanctuary, the one good hour in all of this, because it happened and it matters, and I do not want to build this only out of dread. On the fifth morning, Gerald's wife, small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who I had not yet properly met, brought a plate of biscuits out to my truck while I was parked near the cemetery fence reviewing the previous day's readings. And she did not say much, just set the plate on the dashboard through the open window and told me to eat something warm before I went back out into the cold, and the biscuits were still hot enough to fog the truck's windows. And for 11 minutes, sitting there with butter on my fingers and steam rising off a paper plate, I felt for the first time since my father died something that was not grief and was not dread. It did not last. Nothing here lasts. But it happened, and I want it on the record that it happened, because the warmth is what made the cold that followed feel so much colder. The sixth day is when the pattern started to repeat itself in a way I could no longer file under coincidence. I went back to the throat, not because my job required it. My meter readings from the fissure were complete and filed, but because some part of me needed to know whether the breathing had been real, whether I could reproduce it. The way you press on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. I knelt at the same spot in the same failing light, and the fissure breathed for me again, the same slow inhale, the same delayed exhale of warm air across my face, and this time, in the pause between the two, I heard something underneath the breathing that I had missed the first time, or that had not been there the first time. A sound like settling gravel, like something enormous shifting its weight far below the rock. And beneath that, so faint I have spent 11 months convincing myself I imagined it. Something that resembled a voice, clearing its throat before speaking, and then deciding, apparently, not to. That was the cold. The apparent safety came an hour later, when I drove into the small diner in Mount Carmel and sat across from a state geologist named Priya Anand, who had come up from the regional office to consult on the season's subsidence data, and who listened to my description of the fissure with the patient, faintly amused expression of a scientist humoring a colleague's long week. She told me acoustic resonance in irregular limestone channels can produce exactly the effect I was describing. That fissures over active fires sometimes develop what she called organ pipe behavior, air moving through narrowing rock at specific frequencies that the human ear reads as breath, because the human ear is built to hear breath in everything. An evolutionary habit from back when mistaking the wind for a predator cost you less than mistaking a predator for the wind. I ate my dinner. I felt for the length of that meal entirely reasonable again. That was the warm. The snap came 3 nights later, and it broke something in me that I do not think Priya's explanation, or any explanation, will ever fully repair. I had gone back to my father's house. I want to explain why, because it matters to what he did or failed to do, which the rules of my life have apparently decided I must account for. The house had not yet been demolished, sat empty on its condemned parcel, with a state seal on the door that I, as the inspector of record, had the authority to break for structural assessment, and I told myself that was the reason I was going in. A professional reason, a clean reason. The true reason was that I had not set foot inside it since before he died, had let the funeral and the burial and the estate paperwork happen entirely at a remove, and some small merciless voice in me had decided that 11 months was long enough to keep avoiding a room he had died in alone. The house was cold in the ordinary way. Houses get cold when no one heats them, and dark, and smelled faintly of mildew under the sulfur that had by then worked its way into every fabric surface in Centralia, including the walls of buildings the fire had never physically touched. I walked the rooms with a flashlight, room by room, the way I had walked them in my mind on the second night, the crack in the plaster above the bathroom door exactly where memory had placed it, the third stair creaking exactly the note I remembered. In the kitchen, his coffee mug still sat in the drying rack beside the sink, and I stood there a long time looking at it, a small ordinary object that had outlived him by 11 months, and would likely outlive the house itself. The basement door was at the end of the hall, and it was open, which struck me as wrong before I understood why. My father kept that door closed always, a habit from childhood, because the basement ran uncomfortably close to the property line where the state's early subsidence mapping had flagged elevated risk decades ago, close enough that as a boy, I was forbidden from going down there without him. The door stood open now, 6 inches, into a darkness that felt, even from the hallway, several degrees warmer than the air around me. The same warmth I had been chasing across a half-mile of Route 61 for 6 straight days. Arrived now at the threshold of the one room in the world I had spent my whole childhood being told to stay out of. I went down, the stairs held. I want you to know that, because some part of my training, even in that moment, was cataloging structural integrity, counting the give in each board under my weight, the way you count anything mechanical, when the alternative is counting what you are actually feeling. At the bottom, my flashlight found what I already, on some level, expected to find, and had spent 6 days refusing to let myself expect. A crack in the concrete floor, roughly the width of 2 fingers, running the length of the far wall, and out of that crack, in the cone of my flashlight beam, thin threads of steam rose in the cold basement air, moving with a rhythm I recognized immediately, in and out, the same unhurried, patient breath I had been kneeling beside for 6 days at a fissure half a mile away, except this one was inside my father's house. Under the floor he had walked every day of the last 2 years of his life. Close enough, I understood, with a kind of falling sensation that had nothing to do with the stairs, that he must have heard it too, every single night, alone, and had never once mentioned it to me. I stayed down there longer than was reasonable. I did not run. I want that understood, because everything about this channel's version of me, if you are picturing me correctly, understands that fear this large does not always look like fleeing. Sometimes it looks like kneeling on a cold floor beside a crack that is breathing warm air onto your face, unable to move, because some part of you has finally, after 6 days and 11 months, recognized exactly what it is you have been avoiding, and the recognition itself weighs more than any instinct toward self-preservation. The gap between what I already knew and what I was willing to say out loud had by that point closed almost entirely, but I had not yet permitted myself to name it, and I did not name it that night either. I climbed the stairs, sealed the basement door the way my father always had, and drove back to Mount Carmel with the heater running full and my hands aching from the grip I kept on the wheel. And I did not sleep. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I found myself running through the rooms of the house again in my mind, not to comfort myself this time, but because I had realized, lying in a motel bed 2 towns away, that I had not checked whether the basement crack in his house connected underground to the fissure behind the cemetery, that the whole buffer zone might be laced with the same set of channels, the same single enormous set of lungs, and that my father had lived directly above a piece of it for 2 full years, while I stayed away and told myself that was respect. The final week I spent in Centralia, I told myself I was finishing the survey. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was following the throat's threads across the buffer zone, mapping not gas readings but breath, tracing where the warm air surfaced and where it went quiet. And by the 5th day of that week I had confirmed what I already suspected, that the fissure behind the cemetery and the crack in my father's basement floor were part of a single connected system, running beneath at least 6 of the remaining occupied parcels. A network the state's official maps did not show, and as far as I could determine from the archives, had never shown not once in 60 years of surveys. I went to Priya with this. She looked at my data for a long time, the actual seismic and gas figures, not the parts I could not put into a report, and she told me, carefully, that connected fissure systems of that scale were plausible, even likely, given how long the fire had been burning, and that it would explain a great deal about surface temperature anomalies across the buffer zone. She did not ask about the breathing. I did not offer it. There are things a state geologist can put her name to and things she cannot, and I understood, watching her choose her words, that I had reached the edge of what science was willing to walk with me across. On my last night in the buffer zone, I went back to the throat one final time. After dark, against every rule I had ever written into my own field reports about surveying active fissures at night. I do not fully know why. I have turned that question over more times than I can count in the 11 months since. And the closest I can come to an honest answer is that I needed, once, to stop measuring it and simply sit beside it, the way I had never once, in the last 2 years of his life, simply sat beside my father without an agenda, without a folder of paperwork, without trying to talk him into leaving the one thing he had left. The night was clear and hard frozen, the kind of cold that makes the stars look closer than they are. And I knelt at the edge of the crack in the dark, with no flashlight, no meter, nothing but myself. And I waited. The inhale came first, drawing the cold air down into the earth in one long, unhurried pull. Then the pause, longer than I remembered, long enough that I began to think it had finished. And in that pause I said, out loud to the ground, that I was sorry, that I should have come more, that I should have been there. And my voice sounded small and foolish against 400 acres of burning coal that did not need my apology and had never asked for it. Then the exhale came, warm across my face the way it always had, except this time it did not stop at my face. It moved past me, up and out into the frozen dark, and for one impossible, entirely certain moment, I smelled, underneath the sulfur and the old pennies, the exact smell of my father's flannel jacket, wood smoke and machine oil, and the particular sweetness of the pipe tobacco he had quit 30 years ago, and never fully stopped smelling like. And I understood, kneeling there in the frozen dark above 400 acres of fire, Precisely what the ground had been trying to tell me for 11 days, which was not a threat, and had never once been a threat. It was an accounting. I did not scream. I want you to know that. I sat very still, and the warmth passed over me the way it must have passed over him 1,000 nights alone, in that house, in and out, patient, indifferent to whether anyone above ground was listening. And I understood, in the plainest and quietest way a person can understand anything, that I had been given, 11 months too late, the presents I had failed to give him while he was alive. The ground was not cruel. It was simply keeping something it had been owed, and it had decided, in whatever slow and ancient logic 400 acres of unstoppable fire operates by, that I would be the one to pay the difference, one visit at a time, for as long as I kept coming back. I filed my final report the next morning. It contained gas readings, structural risk assessments, a recommendation for continued monitoring of the Fisher network I had mapped. It did not contain anything I have told you tonight. Some things do not survive translation into a government form, and I have made a kind of peace with carrying the rest of it myself. The way I understand now, my father carried it alone in that house for 2 winters, without once telling his own son what the ground beneath him sounded like at night. I still drive that stretch of Route 61 4 or 5 times a year for work that no longer strictly requires it. The thermometer still reads warm. I have stopped assuming it is broken. I have started, instead, to understand it as a kind of appointment. The way you understand a phone that rings at the same hour every week, and I answer it the only way I know how, which is to slow down and roll the window partway open despite the cold, and let whatever is under that road know that I am still coming back, even now, even having learned exactly what it cost me to do it. My father's flannel jacket still hangs in my closet, 200 miles from Centralia, and it still smells, faintly, of wood smoke and pipe tobacco he quit before I was old enough to remember him smoking it. Some nights I take it down and hold it, not because it comforts me, though I suppose in some limited way it does, but because I have come to understand that the debt I owe him did not end when the ground took its accounting, and I do not expect it ever fully will. I have simply stopped pretending I can pay for it from 2 hours away. There is a particular way some people cross their sevens, a small habitual stroke, through the stem that most handwriting experts will tell you is one of the rarest, most individual markers a person can leave behind. I have seen that exact stroke in 2 places 18 years apart. Only one of those places was ever supposed to have it. Handwriting, properly understood, is not really about the words at all. That surprises people the first time I explain it. What I actually study, what 14 years of forensic document examination trained into me, is pressure and rhythm, and the small unconscious habits a hand repeats without the mind behind it ever noticing, the particular slant of a downstroke, the pause before certain letters, the way some people, without knowing they do it, cross a 7 with a short diagonal stroke through the stem, rather than a straight line across the top. That stroke is rare. In 14 years of casework, I had seen it perhaps 4 times, and each time it was distinctive enough, individual enough, that I could point to it in court with real confidence and say, This hand and no other hand made this mark. I want you to hold on to that fact, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. I came to the Circleville case sideways, the way I come to most things now, through a documentary researcher named Priya, who had spent 2 years working through the sealed evidence recently released by the county, after decades of legal wrangling over the file's status. You may know some version of this case already. Between 1976 and 1994, an anonymous writer sent a long series of threatening letters to residents of a small Ohio town. Letters that displayed an unsettling, specific knowledge of the recipient's private lives, affairs no one else should have known about, arguments that had happened behind closed doors, movements tracked closely enough to suggest sustained patient surveillance rather than casual gossip. The letters escalated over the years, eventually including a mechanically sophisticated booby trap connected to a roadside sign, built by someone with real technical skill and real patience. A man was eventually convicted and served time for the letters and the trap. Doubts about whether he was truly the author have never fully gone away. Not among the people who lived through it. And Priya had been brought in specifically to examine those doubts on camera. She did not need me for the documentary itself. She needed me, quietly, off the record, to look at a small batch of letters the county had never subjected to full forensic review. Letters that had been set aside decades ago as probable copycats or unrelated cranks, filed and forgotten rather than formally excluded. She wanted to know, simply, whether any of them matched the primary author's hand. It was meant to be a week of straightforward comparative work. I want to be honest with you that I took the job partly because it was straightforward, because straightforward work had become, in the years since my formal career ended, something I sought out the way you seek out level ground after you have fallen on uneven ground badly enough. I should tell you why, since you are already settled in with me, and there is nowhere else to put it. 6 years before Circleville, I authenticated a threatening letter in a stalking case with complete professional confidence, testified to that authentication under oath, and watched a man's entire life come apart because of my certainty. His marriage, his employment, 2 years of his freedom, before new evidence eventually proved the letter had not been his hand at all. I was not reckless in that case. I followed every protocol I had ever been trained to follow. I was simply wrong in a way careful protocol does not fully protect against, and the actual author of that letter was never identified, was never stopped, and is, as far as I know, still out there somewhere, having watched a stranger absorb the consequences of what they wrote. I left formal casework not long after. I told people it was burnout. It was not burnout. It was the specific, permanent loss of a certainty I had built my entire identity on. And Circleville, when Priya first described it to me, felt safely distant enough from anything with real stakes that I let myself believe I could do the work cleanly this time. The records office where I did the comparison was a single converted room above the county archive, one window facing the town's quiet main street, boxes of evidence stacked along every wall, the whole space smelling of dry paper and old toner in a way that gets into your fingertips after a few hours of handling and does not fully leave by evening. I remember the town outside that window being unusually still on my first afternoon there, the particular stillness of a place that has spent a long time watching its own mailboxes and Priya telling me, half joking, that some of the older residents still check their mail every single day out of habit, decades after the letters had stopped. A habit none of them had ever consciously decided to keep, and none of them seemed able to fully set down. I spent my first 3 days doing careful, unremarkable comparative analysis, cross-referencing the known primary letters against the sealed secondary batch, and I found, as expected, mostly what you would expect. Several clear copycats, amateur imitations that fell apart under close inspection. A few letters too degraded for confident analysis, either way. Ordinary, patient work. I documented everything precisely, the way I have always documented everything, and I began to believe by the third evening that I would finish the week with a clean, defensible report, and nothing more complicated than that. The letter that changed things was near the bottom of the fourth box. Unremarkable at first glance. Brief. Addressed to a resident whose name meant nothing to me. And it was in reading through it a second time, checking a particular capital G against the primary author's known formation, that I noticed the 7. It appeared only once in the letter in a date, and it carried that same short diagonal stroke through the stem I had seen perhaps 4 times in 14 years of casework, a marker rare enough that finding it twice within one case would already have been notable. I checked it against the primary letters immediately, and it matched, cleanly, confidently, exactly the kind of individual marker I would have testified to without hesitation in my old life. I logged it. I moved on to the next letter in the box, telling myself, reasonably, that this was simply good news for the documentary. One more secondary letter now confirmed as belonging to the primary author after all. It was 2 nights later, working alone after Priya had gone back to her hotel, cross-referencing a separate, entirely unrelated exemplar the county had included for calibration purposes, an old handwritten property deed correction from decades before the letters began, that I found the same stroke a second time, in a context that made no sense at all. I sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet except for the old radiator ticking somewhere behind the wall, and I did what any careful examiner does when a finding does not fit. I assumed error first. I told myself, calmly and precisely, that a diagonal stroke through a 7 stem, while individually rare, is not so rare that 2 unrelated documents from the same rural county, written within a few decades of each other, could not simply share it by coincidence. That handwriting habits sometimes cluster regionally or generationally, in ways that mimic individuality without actually representing it. I logged the anomaly as coincidental and moved to close the file for the night. I want you to notice how easily that explanation arrived, because I have spent my whole career trusting exactly that ease, and it has already cost one innocent man 2 years of his life for trusting it wrongly once before. Sleep did not come easily after that. I lay in the small guest house Priya had arranged for me, listening to a house settle the way houses do, and found myself doing the quiet, involuntary arithmetic my training has never let me fully turn off, counting backward through every document I had handled that week, wondering how many other places that same stroke might be sitting, unnoticed, in evidence nobody had ever thought to compare against anything but itself. I went back to the archive the next morning and did something outside the scope of what Priya had actually asked for. I began pulling every document in the building that contained handwriting from the relevant decades, deed corrections, old permit applications, unrelated case files stored in the same building, for reasons of simple bureaucratic convenience, cross-referencing all of it against that single distinctive stroke. And by the end of that day, I had found it 4 more times. In documents spanning almost 30 years, in contexts with no apparent connection to each other, or to the letters at all. I do not think I can fully explain to you what that discovery did to the careful, methodical part of my mind that has always been the part I trusted most. A marker that individual, appearing that many times across that many unrelated documents, should not be possible under any model of handwriting analysis I have ever been trained in. Either my entire understanding of what makes a mark individual was wrong, which felt in that room, at that hour, like the ground itself giving way beneath something I had built my whole professional identity on, or something else was true, something I did not yet have language for, and did not, if I am honest, want to find language for. Priya noticed the change in me before I was willing to name it myself. She commented gently, on my 3rd sleepless night in a row, that I looked unwell, and I told her, truthfully as far as I understood it then, that I had found an anomaly worth running down properly before I could finish the report, and she, trusting my expertise the way people have always trusted it, let me keep working. It was on the 5th night, alone again, that I made the decision I have turned over in my mind more times than any other decision in my life. I pulled the primary conviction file itself, the letters attributed definitively to the convicted man, and began comparing his known handwriting, taken from documents unrelated to the letters entirely, prison intake forms, an old employment application, against that same stroke. It was not there, not once, in any document bearing his confirmed hand. I sat in that office for a long time after that, the radiator ticking, the town outside, utterly dark and utterly still, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once, rather than gradually, exactly what I was looking at, and exactly why it terrified me, more than anything a physical threat ever could have. The stroke I had spent a week tracking, confident, rare, individually unmistakable, belonged to no single identifiable person at all. It appeared and disappeared across 3 decades of unrelated documents in that county, with no consistent author behind it, no single hand I could ever, under any protocol I had ever trusted, attach a name to. I want to tell you I found a rational explanation that night, and slept easily afterward. I did not, and I have stopped expecting to. What I found instead, sitting alone in that small paper-smelling office with the town holding its old habitual stillness outside the window, was the specific, unglamorous, unbearable possibility that the mark I had spent 14 years training myself to recognize as absolute proof of individual identity might not, in this one particular county, over this one particular set of decades, mean what I had always needed it to mean. That some hands are shared in ways my training never accounted for. Or worse, quieter and harder to sit with even now. That the stroke itself was never really about a person at all, only about a place, patient and watching, that had simply been finding new hands to write through, for longer than anyone in that town had ever wanted to know. I finished the report I owed Priya. I did not include what I found in the calibration documents. I told myself this was professional caution, that an anomaly without a defensible explanation had no place in a formal review, and that explanation is, on its surface, entirely true. I have not taken a private handwriting case since. I still notice sevens, though, more than I would like to admit, on grocery receipts, on forms I am handed at the doctor's office, on notes left on my own desk by people I trust completely. And each time for 1/2 of 1 second before I can stop it, some old trained part of my mind checks the stem, out of a habit I understand now I may never fully unlearn. The same way, I suspect, some people in that small Ohio town still check their mail every morning, decades after any reasonable person would have stopped. Unable to say exactly why, only that the checking itself has become the only way they know how to feel for one more day that they were the one doing the watching. This story is based on the real and still unresolved Dyatlov Pass incident of February 1959, in which 9 experienced hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains, under circumstances that remain formally unexplained. The Soviet investigation's official cause of death, a compelling unknown natural force, has never been superseded by a conclusive alternative explanation. Kolotsiakl, in the northern Ural Range, a name that, in the local Mansi language, already means dead mountain. Long before 1959, 9 experienced hikers died on a routine winter trek. Their tent was found cut open from the inside, and the group had fled into sub-zero cold and deep snow, partially or fully undressed, with no clear reason to abandon shelter. Some bodies showed massive internal injuries, crushed ribs, a fractured skull, with no external bruising to explain it. Injuries investigators compared to a car crash. One woman was found missing her tongue and eyes. Elevated radiation was later detected on some clothing. The Soviet investigation's official closing statement cited death by a compelling unknown force. Every detail is documented in the original case file, later partially declassified, and it remains formally unsolved. A mountain rescue volunteer who was part of the search party and was the one to find the slashed tent. His wound. He has spent decades since unable to explain what he saw inside it, and rather than staying away from the range, he became a guide who routes climbers near, but never through, the pass, circling something he can't name and can't leave alone. The Mansi people avoided the mountain for generations before the incident, describing it as a place that does not permit people to stay. Hikers in the decades since report unexplained lights over the ridge, and camps they feel compelled to abandon in the night without knowing why. I have spent 40 years guiding climbers through the northern Urals, and that I route every single one of them around a ridge I will not cross, and that not one of them has ever asked me why closely enough that I could not deflect the question with a joke about permits, or weather, or wolves. There are no wolves on Kolotsiakl. I have never seen one there in 40 years, and I have looked, because a wolf would have been a mercy. A wolf would have been an answer with teeth I could understand. I want to tell you what I found on that mountain in February of 1959. When I was young enough to still believe that every mystery has a shape you can eventually hold in your hands, I no longer believe that. I want you to understand why, in the order that I came to understand it myself, because the order matters more than I once thought it did. 9 of them went up that slope. Students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic, experienced enough to be trusted with a Category 3 route, the hardest classification the Soviet Hiking Federation gave in the dead of a Ural winter, which is not a season so much as a verdict. Their leader, Igor, was 23 and had led harder routes than this one. They were not fools. They were not amateurs stumbling into weather they did not understand. That is the first thing you must hold on to, because everything that follows only makes sense once you accept that these were careful people, and carefulness did not save them. I was part of the search party sent after them when they failed to send the telegram confirming their return. It took us weeks to find the camp, because the range does not give up what it takes easily. And when we finally found the tent, half collapsed under snow on the open slope of Kolatsia, I was the one closest when we cut through the drift covering it. The tent had already been cut, not by us. From the inside, in long slashes, the kind a person makes when getting out through a door is somehow worse than getting out through canvas. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I have sat with it for 40 years. 9 people, in temperatures cold enough to kill an exposed man in under an hour, chose to cut their way out of the one shelter standing between them and that cold, rather than walk the several feet to the actual tent flap. Whatever was outside that tent, in their minds in that moment, was faster to escape by opening a hole in the fabric wall than by using the door. We found the first 2 bodies at the tree line, over a kilometer down the slope beneath a large cedar. They were in their underwear, no coats, no boots, in temperatures that night likely fell below -25 degrees. The cedar had branches broken off up to 5 meters high, snapped by someone who had climbed it, we believe, to see something, or to escape something. Though what waits at 5 meters up a tree that does not wait at ground level, I have never been able to answer for myself. Near the cedar, we found the remains of a small fire, ash and a few embers, evidence that at least 2 of them had tried, however briefly, to survive there half-dressed before the cold or something else ended the attempt. 3 more were found strung out along a line back toward the tent, as though they had tried to return for supplies, or for the others, and had not made it. Their positions suggested they died at different times, on the same route, walking the same desperate line back and forth between a fire that could not save them, and a tent they had already destroyed the usefulness of. The last 4 we did not find until the spring thaw, buried in a ravine under snow that had been 4 meters deep in places. And it is these 4 that I have never been able to explain to my own satisfaction, though I have tried for 40 years, comma by comma, the way you turn a stone in your hand looking for a crack that will finally let you inside it. 1 of the 4 had a fractured skull. 2 had crushed chests, injuries the medical examiner later compared, in his official report, to what you would see in a person struck by a moving vehicle, or thrown from a significant height. And there was no external bruising to account for it. No sign of a blow, as though the force that broke them from the inside had never touched the surface at all. 1 of the women in that ravine was missing her tongue, along with both eyes, part of her lips, and some facial tissue. The examiners attributed this, in the end, to decomposition in running water beneath the snow, and perhaps that is true. I have chosen most days to let it be true, because the alternative is a thought I do not have room in myself to carry. Some of their clothing, when tested later, showed elevated levels of radioactivity, a fact that has never been fully explained, and that has fed every theory from military testing gone wrong to things I will not repeat to you, because repeating them gives them a shape they do not deserve. The official investigation, when it closed, gave a cause of death that has outlived every scientist who signed it. Death caused by a compelling, unknown natural force. I have read that phrase more times than any other sentence in my life. I still do not know what it means. I am no longer certain the men who wrote it knew either. Only that it was the truest thing they were permitted to say, and that a government does not print the word unknown onto an official document unless the alternative was somehow worse. The Mansi people, who have lived in that range far longer than any polytechnic student, had a name for that mountain before any of this happened. Kolatsiak, Dead Mountain, in their language, and they will tell you, if you ask them the right way, in the right season, that the name predates the incident by generations, that their ancestors avoided the slope long before 9 strangers proved they were right to. I have asked the old Mansi guides what waits up there. Most will not answer directly. One told me, the only time I ever pressed him on it, that the mountain does not want anything from you. It simply does not permit you to stay. He said it the way a man says something he has decided not to argue with any further. The way you accept weather instead of debating it. I still guide climbers through that range every season, and every season I route them around that one ridge, telling them it is closed, or dangerous, or simply not worth the detour. And every season, at least one climber pushes back, wanting to see the famous slope for themselves. And every season I find some reason to insist, in a voice I do not entirely control, that we go another way. I have stood at the base of that ridge alone only once since 1959, on the anniversary, because I told myself I owed it to them to stand there and remember properly. I do not recommend that anyone do what I did. The wind on that slope does not sound like wind anywhere else I have stood in 40 years of standing on mountains. And there is a point, if you stay long enough in the particular gray light, before real dark, where you stop being certain the wind is the only thing making that sound. I left before dark fully came. I have never gone back. I tell my climbers it is closed. That is not a lie. It is closed the same way a door is closed once you understand it should never be opened again. And I have spent 40 years being the kind of guide who keeps that door shut, quietly, without ever having to explain to a single one of them why. This story is about a woman who believed, more than anything else, in the discipline of looking carefully. It is also about a piece of ground that has been empty for 4 centuries, and what it means when empty ground still seems to be waiting on something. Get comfortable. I am going to take my time with this one. There is a kind of quiet that only exists where something used to be. I did not know that until I stood in a clearing that has been empty for over 400 years, and felt very clearly that I was not standing there alone. My name does not matter for this story, so I will leave it where I have left it every other time I have told this. Folded up somewhere, I do not have to look at it directly. What matters is that for 11 years, I was a wetland ecologist, the kind who spends more time on her knees in mud than standing upright in an office. And that, in October of the year I want to tell you about, I was sent to Roanoke Island to complete a vegetation and soil disturbance survey along the edge of the historic colony site. A routine piece of work commissioned ahead of a shoreline stabilization project that, as far as I know, was never actually built. I want you to understand what that kind of survey involves, because it matters later. You walk a grid, slow and exact, noting where the soil compaction changes, where root systems have grown around something that used to be there and is not there now, where the color of the earth shifts in a way that tells you, if you know how to read it, that something was disturbed once and then left to heal over on its own terms. It is patient work. It rewards a mind that does not need an answer quickly. I was, for most of my adult life, very proud of having exactly that kind of mind. The mainland side of Roanoke Island does not feel like much when you first arrive. Low scrub pine, a scatter of gift shops, a reconstructed fort that most visitors photograph and never really look at. But the maritime forest along the marsh edge, where I was working, feels different the moment you step off the gravel path and into it. The live oaks lean sideways from decades of wind, dressed heavy in Spanish moss. The light comes down through them, broken and gray-green, the way light comes down through water. The ground smells like standing water and crushed pine needles together, sweet and sour at once. A smell that gets into cotton and stays there no matter how many times you wash it. And somewhere past the tree line the marsh breathes its slow tidal breath, in and out all day and all night, whether anyone is there to hear it or not. I knew the history the way anyone who has spent a season on that island comes to know it, not from books so much as from the ground itself insisting on it. More than 100 English settlers arrived in 1587. Among them a child named Virginia Dare, the first English infant born on this continent. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies not long after, and by the time circumstances allowed his return 3 years later, the colony was simply gone. No bodies, no sign of a struggle. No burned structures, no scattered belongings, nothing that told the story of an attack or an illness or a slow starving. Just an empty settlement, dismantled with what looked like care rather than violence, and a single word carved into a wooden post at the entrance to the fort. Croatoan, the name of a nearby island and its allied people, and also, for 400 years, the only word anyone has ever had to work with. I remember standing in that clearing on my first morning, GPS unit in hand, thinking, with the particular satisfaction of someone who trusts her own competence completely, that whatever had actually happened there had simply never been properly investigated by someone patient enough to do it right. I did not say this aloud to anyone. I did not need to. It was the quiet, load-bearing belief my whole career stood on, the same belief that had carried me 6 years earlier through search grids in a different forest entirely, looking for my younger brother Callum, who went out on a day hike in the Blue Ridge and did not come back, and who was never found, not by the search teams, not by the volunteers, not by me, though I went back to that mountain on my own for 2 full years after everyone else had stopped. I do not talk about Callum easily, so I am only going to tell you the part that matters here. I have never accepted that a person can simply not be found. I have built an entire career on the conviction that the ground remembers everything, that soil holds a record of disturbance the way a photograph holds light, and that anyone missing long enough is not unsolved, only insufficiently searched. That belief is the reason I became who I became. It is also, I understand now, the reason the Roanoke Forest let me get as close as it did. The first 3 days of the survey were uneventful in the way fieldwork usually is, meaning tedious in a way that becomes its own kind of peace. I walked the grid, logged soil samples, photographed root disturbance patterns, and each evening I drove back to the small rented cabin on the sound side of the island and made the same simple dinner and fell asleep before 9, worn out, the good kind of tired that comes from a full day of careful attention. On the 3rd night, lying in bed with the window cracked to the sound of the marsh, I heard, for the first time, a sound from somewhere out past the tree line that did not belong to any bird or animal I could name. Low and rhythmic, almost like breathing, almost like something dragging itself once through wet ground and then stopping. I told myself it was the tide moving through the marsh grass. I have never in my life had trouble finding a rational explanation, and that night was no different. I wrote nothing about it in my field notes. I went back to sleep within the hour. It was on the 4th day that the survey grid brought me to the northernmost section of the forest, an area the historical maps mark only as unconfirmed extent, meaning the boundary of where the original colony's clearing may have reached is not precisely known. The trees there grow closer together than anywhere else on the site. Old-growth live oak with roots that surface and knot across the ground like something trying to hold the earth down by force. And the moss hangs so heavy that even at midday the light comes through gray and thin, the way it does just before real dark. I was on my knees taking a soil core sample when I found the first disturbance pattern that did not match anything in my training. A compaction ring, nearly perfect, roughly 6 feet across. The soil inside it dense and dark in a way that suggested repeated pressure over a long period, and around its edge, root growth that had clearly bent and redirected itself decades ago to avoid growing into that specific circle of ground. I have seen compaction rings before. Foundations leave them. Fire pits leave them. But this ring had no charcoal, no stone, no post holes, nothing that explained what had stood there long enough or been pressed into that ground often enough to leave a mark the forest itself had grown around rather than through. I remember the particular quiet that settled over me kneeling there. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing because nothing else around you seems to be making any sound at all. The marsh had gone still. The birds, which had been a steady background hum all morning, had simply stopped. I told myself, in the calm and practiced voice I have always used on myself in moments like that birds go quiet before weather changes, that the marsh always falls still at certain points in the tide cycle, that a compaction ring with no clear origin is simply a compaction ring that needs a more thorough follow-up survey, logged, photographed, explained later with better equipment. I wrote all of this down. I even underlined follow-up required. The way you underline a phrase you are trying to make yourself believe is sufficient. That was the warm part. The part where the mind builds its shelter and, for a while, actually believes it will hold. I finished the sample, packed my kit, and started back toward the trail. And it was on that walk back, moving through the closest stand of the old oaks, that I noticed the second thing, small enough that I almost let it pass without stopping. Carved into the bark of one of the largest trees, weathered nearly smooth by what must have been decades of exposure, was a single letter. Not a full word, just the first letter, deep and old, the kind of mark that takes real effort and real time to carve into living wood, and then simply stops, unfinished, as though whoever began it either ran out of time or changed their mind about what they wanted the tree to say. I stood in front of that tree for a long time. I am a scientist by training and by temperament, and I want you to understand that everything in me wanted, more than anything, to explain that letter away. Vandalism, coincidence, a modern visitor's careless joke half a mile off the marked trail. I told myself all of these things. I photographed the mark for the record. I did not, that day, let myself think the word the letter might have been the beginning of. I want to tell you honestly that I almost stopped the survey there. I did not. I have never in my life been the kind of person who stops at almost, and that, I understand now, was never a strength, so much as it was the exact shape of the door the forest needed me to walk through. The fifth day was when the temperature dropped without warning. A hard cold front rolling in off the sound faster than the forecast had predicted, and I made the decision, against my better judgment, to finish the northern grid section before the weather worsened, rather than lose a full day waiting it out. I want you to understand that this was not recklessness. It was, in my mind, simply thoroughness, the same quality that had always made me good at my work, the same quality that had kept me on that Blue Ridge Mountain 2 years past the point when everyone else, including the sheriff's department, including my own parents, had quietly asked me to let it go. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up hard enough to move the moss in long, slow waves overhead, and the light through the canopy had gone the flat gray of a coming storm. I was working the last quadrant of the grid, close to where I had found the compaction ring 2 days before. When I found the post, it was not standing upright the way a fence post stands. It had fallen or been felled sometime long ago, and lay half-buried under decades of leaf litter and soil, only 1.5 feet of its length still visible above ground, weathered gray and soft with rot along one edge. I would not have noticed it at all, except that my boot caught against something solid beneath the leaves, and when I knelt to clear the debris away, already assembling the explanation, before I had even fully uncovered what I was looking at, old survey marker, forgotten fence line, nothing unusual for land this old. I found the second letter. It sat directly beneath the first tree's mark, in a straight line north, carved into this fallen post the same way, deep and deliberate. And unlike the tree, this one had not been left unfinished. 2 letters. Enough, if you already knew the story the way I did, to understand exactly what word was beginning to spell itself out across a stretch of forest that was not supposed to hold any trace of the colony at all, this far north of the marked historical boundary, in ground the maps themselves admit no one has ever confirmed. I sat back on my heels in the cold and the wind, and I did not move for what felt like a very long time. My hands had gone still in the specific way hands go still, not from calm, but from something past it. And I became aware, the way you become aware of your own heartbeat only once it has gotten too loud to ignore, that the marsh beyond the tree line had gone utterly silent again. No wind moving through it, no water, no birds, nothing. As though the whole width of that wetland had stopped breathing to watch what I would do next. I told myself, one final time, that this was simply an older marking system, a survey convention from decades past. Initials, coordinates, nothing more. And I want you to know that some part of me still believed that even as I stood and began walking north, following the line the two marks had already drawn for me, because I have never in my life been able to leave a pattern half explained. That is not bravery. I understand that now. It has only ever been the shape of my particular wound. The same shape that kept me on a mountain 2 years past reason, looking for an answer the ground was never going to give me, because some absences are not unsolved. They are only unwilling to be found. The trees grew closer together as I walked, the moss thicker, the light dimmer, until I came into a clearing I had not marked on any survey map, roughly circular. The ground within it strangely bare of undergrowth, in a way nothing else in that forest was. And at its center, another post, this one still standing, weathered nearly black, and carved into it, complete, deep enough that even 4 centuries of exposure had not softened its edges past reading. I am not going to tell you the whole word. I think you already know it. What I will tell you is what happened in the half-second after I read it. Because that half-second is the only part of this story that still visits me with any regularity. The clearing did not move. Nothing rushed toward me out of the tree line. No shape, no sound, nothing my training would have recognized as a threat. What happened instead was smaller and far worse. The cold in the air simply stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a tension, the specific, unmistakable sensation of being observed by something that has been patient for a very long time and has finally, after 400 years, found someone willing to walk the whole distance the marks were laid out to lead. My vision narrowed at the edges, the way a photograph darkens toward its corners, and I felt my own pulse arrive in my throat before my mind had caught up to naming what I was afraid of. And somewhere in that stillness I understood, not with the trained analytical part of my mind that had carried me my whole career, but somewhere lower, somewhere past explanation, that I had not found the answer to what happened to the lost colony. I had been led to it. I do not remember the walk back to my truck in any detail that would make a coherent account. I know that the cold front broke into hard rain before I reached the gravel road, and that I drove straight to the ferry dock and did not go back to the cabin at all, and that I called the survey office the next morning and told them, in a voice I worked very hard to keep steady, that I would not be returning to complete the northern grid section, and that I never gave them, or anyone since, a reason that made any real sense on paper. I do not work in the field anymore. I teach now at a small college 2 states away, soil science to undergraduates who have never once had to kneel in wet ground and read what it is trying to tell them, and most days that distance feels like enough. But some nights, when the weather turns the way it turned on that 5th day, I think about Callum, about the mountain, about the 2 years I spent refusing to accept that an absence could simply remain an absence, And I think about that clearing, bare ground in the middle of an old-growth forest that should have reclaimed it centuries ago, waiting the way it had clearly been waiting a very long time, for someone patient enough, and proud enough, and wounded enough, to walk the whole distance and read the word out loud. I have never gone back. I tell myself that is enough, that walking away when I did was its own kind of survival. But some part of me, the part that has never once in its life been able to leave a pattern half explained, still lies awake some nights doing the quiet arithmetic of it, wondering how many letters that post had held before mine, and whether somewhere in that forest, under decades of leaf litter, mine has already been added to the line. Six people have died on that island, trying to reach something no one has ever actually found. I went there certain I understood exactly how far the seventh mistake was from mine. I was wrong about the distance. A woman who spent her whole career reading ground the way other people read faces, certain that, if she looked closely enough, carefully enough, the earth would always tell her the truth in time. It is about what happens when the ground decides to keep something back anyway. Settle in. This one takes its time getting where it is going, the same as the digging did. I will tell you what I am, because that has always mattered more than what anyone called me. I am a geotechnical engineer, which means, in the plainest terms I can give you, that I spend my walking life reading what the ground underneath us is about to do before it does it. Shaft stability, mine collapse risk, the slow, silent shifting of earth under load. That has been my whole career. 14 years of it. And for most of those years, I was very, very good at my job. I want to say that plainly before I tell you the rest, because what happened to me on Oak Island was not the story of an incompetent woman who wandered somewhere she had no business being. It was the story of a competent one, maybe the most competent person on that whole site, and how competence, when it is standing on the wrong ground, can become the very thing that walks you further in than anyone with less confidence would have gone. You have likely heard of Oak Island the way most people have, a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, where, since 1795, generations of treasure hunters have poured money and equipment and, eventually, their own lives into a shaft in the ground that everyone believes was built on purpose to hide something, and to punish anyone who tried to take it. I will not pretend to know what people believe is down there. Pirate gold, a lost manuscript, something religious, something the specifics never mattered much to me. What mattered to me, professionally, was the shaft itself, an engineering problem 2 centuries old, a structure that has resisted excavation through a combination of natural instability and what may or may not have been deliberate flood tunnels built to drown anyone who dug too deep. 6 people have died trying to reach the bottom of it. Not 6 over a single reckless decade. 6 across 200 years. A slow accumulating cost that the island itself seems, if you listen to the people who live near it long enough, to be keeping some kind of account of. I was brought onto the modern excavation site as a stabilization consultant after a previous contractor flagged serious concerns about ground movement in one of the newer support shafts. Work that had been ongoing for several years by the time I arrived, backed by a private consortium with more money than most treasure hunting operations before them had ever had access to. My job was simple on paper. Assess the shaft's structural integrity, identify where the surrounding earth was likely to shift or collapse under continued excavation, and tell the crew, in language they could act on, where it was safe to dig and where it was not. I took the job knowing the way you know something without letting yourself look at it directly, that I was choosing it partly because it terrified me, and that this had become, somewhere in the years before, exactly the kind of work I kept seeking out. I should tell you why, since you are already sitting in the dark with me, and there is nowhere else to put it. 4 years before Oak Island, I was the lead engineer on a commercial mining operation out west, and I flagged what I believed, at the time, was a minor instability in a support wall 2 levels down, a reading that fell just inside acceptable tolerance according to every model I had access to. I signed off on continued extraction. 9 days later, that wall failed, and a man named Doug, who had worked that mine for 11 years and had 2 daughters younger than 10, was one of 3 people caught in the collapse, and the only one who did not walk out of it. The inquiry cleared me of formal negligence. My own reading of the data has never once agreed with that verdict, and I have spent every year, since taking the contracts nobody else wanted, the unstable ground, the sites with histories, telling myself I was simply the engineer willing to go where others would not, when the truer thing, the thing I only understood fully on Oak Island, is that I had been quietly testing, over and over, whether I could still trust my own judgment, or whether Doug's death had permanently broken something in my ability to read the ground honestly. The island itself, when I first arrived, was smaller and quieter than I expected. Thick pine forest, pressing close around a cleared central site, a marsh at the low end that breathed in and out, with the tide even on still days, and a smell in the air near the pit that I have never fully been able to shake since. Wet clay and old rust together. A mineral smell that gets into your clothes and your hands and does not wash out easily. The way certain smells attach themselves permanently to a place in your memory rather than simply passing through it. The crew was small, a rotating group of engineers, historians, and excavation workers, most of whom had been on the project for years and had developed the particular calm fatalism of people who have made peace with working somewhere dangerous for a long time. They told me about the 6 deaths on my first afternoon, almost casually, the way you would mention a site's history to any new hire. And one of the older excavation supervisors, a quiet man named Roy, who had worked the island for over a decade, told me, without any real drama in his voice, that the island does not take anyone by accident. Every death, he said, had come at a moment when someone stopped double-checking, when confidence outran caution by even a small margin. He said it the way you would repeat a piece of practical safety advice, not a ghost story, and something about the flatness of his delivery settled into me more deeply than any dramatic warning would have. I spent my first week doing exactly what I was hired to do, running instrumentation checks, mapping ground movement patterns, cross-referencing historical excavation records against current structural data. I was good at this part. I want you to understand how good, because it matters for what came later. I found within days 3 points of genuine concern the previous contractor had missed. Small but real instabilities in the shaft's eastern support wall, exactly the kind of overlooked detail that a career spent reading dangerous ground trains you to catch. I flagged them. Work paused in that section while reinforcement was scheduled. I remember feeling, for the first time in a long while, something close to pride in my own competence. The quiet satisfaction of having caught a real problem before it became a real tragedy. It was on the 10th night, working alone after the crew had gone back to the mainland for the weekend, that I first noticed the sound. I had stayed behind to run a final set of instrumentation readings on the eastern wall before the reinforcement work began, a task that required quiet, undisturbed conditions, and, ideally, no vibration from other equipment or foot traffic. The site at night is not like most construction sites. There is no ambient light pollution to soften the dark, no distant traffic hum, only the pines moving overhead and the marsh breathing somewhere past the tree line. And inside that quiet I heard, coming from somewhere below the shaft platform, a low rhythmic sound, almost like water moving through a narrow space, except the tide records I had access to told me clearly that the marsh was at low water and should have been still. I stood at the platform edge with my flashlight pointed down into the shaft, and I told myself calmly and professionally, the way I have told myself things my entire career, that groundwater movement through the shaft's old flood tunnel system was a well-documented phenomenon on this island, that the tunnels, whether natural or constructed centuries ago, still carried water in patterns that did not always match surface tide readings exactly, and that what I was hearing was simply that, an engineering fact, rather than anything requiring further thought. I made a note of it in my log. Subsurface water movement, timing inconsistent with surface tide, worth investigating further. I even underlined worth investigating. The way you underline something you are trying to convince yourself is a sufficient answer for tonight. That was the warm part. I want you to notice how quickly and how naturally it arrived, because that ease has always been both my greatest professional asset, and, I understand now, the exact door through which I have let the worst things into my life. I went back to the readings and worked for another hour, and the sound did not return. And by midnight, I had convinced myself thoroughly enough to begin packing up my equipment for the night. It was on my way back across the platform, flashlight sweeping the ground ahead of me out of pure habit, that I noticed the second thing, and this one I could not explain nearly as easily. Near the eastern wall, in the section I had flagged for reinforcement only days before, a fresh crack had opened in the support timber, thin but unmistakable, running at an angle that, to my trained eye, indicated pressure from below rather than above. Exactly the kind of stress pattern that should not exist in a wall that had not yet been subjected to any new excavation load. I knelt and examined it closely, running my fingers along its edge the way I have done thousands of times in my career, reading the wood grain, the depth, the direction, everything my training has ever taught me to read in a piece of failing structure. And every single thing I found told me the same impossible thing. Something below that wall had pushed against it recently, with real, sustained force, though nothing in the excavation schedule accounted for any new activity in that section at all. My mouth went dry in the particular way it goes dry when the body understands something before the mind is ready to follow it there. And I remember kneeling in front of that crack for a long moment, my flashlight beam not quite steady in my hand, doing the quiet arithmetic engineers do without meaning to, working out how much force it would take to produce a fracture pattern like that, and arriving each time at a number too large for anything the tide records could explain. I told myself one more time that ground settling after recent excavation nearby could produce exactly this kind of secondary stress. A phenomenon rare but not unheard of in shaft work this old, and I logged the crack for morning inspection and made myself walk back to the site trailer, instead of standing there any longer turning the numbers over in my head. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the narrow trailer bunk listening to the pines moving overhead, and, underneath that sound, so faint I could never be fully certain I was not imagining it, the same slow rhythmic movement I had heard near the shaft hours before, as though whatever was moving down there had simply followed the sound of my footsteps back toward where I was trying to rest. The crew returned 2 days later, and I raised the crack with the site director, a careful, thorough man named Alan who had run engineering assessments on this island for longer than I had been in the profession, and together we examined it in daylight. And Alan, reading the same fracture pattern I had read alone in the dark, went quiet in a way I had not seen from him before, and told me, after a long moment, that he had seen a crack with that exact angled pressure signature only once before in all his years on the island, in the section of the eastern wall closest to where the 5th death on the island's long record had occurred, nearly 2 decades earlier, in a collapse that had never been fully explained by the equipment failure the official report eventually settled on. I want to tell you that this was the moment I stepped back, that I recognized the pattern clearly enough to simply walk away from the section entirely and let someone else make the final call. I did not. The same competence that had once told me a support wall was within acceptable tolerance, the same competence that quietly killed a man named Doug, pulled me instead toward the crack rather than away from it, because I have never once in my career been able to leave a structural question half answered, and because some part of me, the part I have never fully admitted to anyone until tonight, had been waiting years for exactly this kind of dangerous ground to test, finally, whether I had actually learned anything at all. I spent the following week running deeper instrumentation into that section, extending sensor lines further down than the site had previously mapped, working later each night than the schedule required, telling Alan and the crew that I simply wanted to be thorough before signing off on reinforcement, which was true, and also not the whole truth, because somewhere underneath the professional explanation I gave them, I understood I was chasing the same rhythmic sound I had heard on my 10th night, certain, in the particular blind certainty of someone who has spent a career proving her own instincts right, that I would be the one who finally understood what those 6 deaths had actually been reaching toward. On my final night on that section, working alone again after the crew had left for the evening, the deeper sensor readings returned something that made no structural sense at all. A void space beneath the eastern wall, larger and more precisely shaped than any natural cavity had a right to be, its edges too regular, too deliberate, the kind of geometry that does not occur by accident in 200-year-old ground. I stood at the platform with the readout in my hands, my vision narrowing at the edges the way it narrows under real pressure. My pulse arriving loud in my own ears before my mind had caught up to naming what I was afraid of. And I understood, standing there, that I had done exactly what 5 people before me had done in that same section. Followed careful, patient expertise one measurement past the point where expertise should have told me to stop. The crack in the wall widened while I stood there. Not violently. Quietly, the way ice cracks across a lake at night. A single low sound, and then a silence more complete than any silence I have ever stood inside. And in that silence I felt, with absolute clarity, the same rhythmic movement from below. Closer now, patient, unhurried. The movement of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone thorough enough to dig this close and was not, even now, in any hurry to be found. I did not go closer. I want you to know that clearly, because it is the only part of this story I am genuinely proud of. I stood at the edge of that platform for what felt like a very long time, and then I turned, and I walked back across the site to the trailer, and I did not look behind me even once, though every trained instinct I have ever had told me to go back and read the ground one more time, just to be certain. Just to finish the measurement properly. I left the island 3 days later. I told the consortium it was a scheduling conflict, and I have not returned since, and I do not work underground anymore at all. Not out of any belief that I understand what is actually buried beneath that shaft, but because I finally understood, standing at that platform edge, that some ground is not meant to be fully read. And that the very instinct that has always told me to keep measuring, keep checking, keep proving myself capable of trusting my own judgment, is the exact instinct that has already cost one person his life and nearly cost the island its 7th. I think about Doug most nights still, and I think, more than I expected to, about that crack widening in the dark, and about how close I came to being the engineer thorough enough to become the number the island has apparently been waiting on. I have made my peace, as much peace as I am able to make, with not knowing what is down there. I have not made peace with how easily, how naturally, my own competence nearly walked me the rest of the way in. I check my own judgment differently now, in every part of my life. Not once in moving on, but twice. The way a door needs to be checked twice before you can trust that it is truly closed. I understand now that the first time is only ever confidence. It is the second time, the one you make yourself do, even when everything in you says, you have already looked closely enough. That tells you whether you can actually trust what you are seeing, or whether you have simply gotten very good over a very long career at explaining away exactly the thing that was trying to warn you. A woman who spent her whole career learning to see the truth hiding inside a child's face. And what happened the one time that skill turned toward something it was never built to find? It is slow. It stays close to the ground the whole way through. I think that is exactly how it needs to be told. I have photographed thousands of children on that beach, and I know, the way you know your own hands, what a child's face is supposed to do in a photograph. I am still trying to explain what I saw in one of mine. I will tell you what I did for a living because that is the only part of me that is actually relevant to what happened. For 9 years, I worked as a forensic facial artist, first with the South Australia Police, and later on contract for cases further afield. And the work was exactly what it sounds like, and also nothing like what people imagine. You are not drawing faces from imagination. You are drawing faces from grief, from a mother's shaking description of a chin, from a witness who saw someone for 4 seconds through a car window and has spent every night since trying to hold on to those 4 seconds before they dissolve completely. You learn, doing that work long enough, to see a face the way most people never have to. Not as a whole impression, but as a set of measurable relationships. The distance between the eyes as a fraction of the distance across the cheekbones. The particular way a jaw squares or does not square. The small, consistent geometry that makes one child unmistakably itself and no other child at all. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, because what happened to me was not a failure of skill. It was, if anything, the opposite. And that is a harder thing to carry than simple incompetence would have been. 11 years ago, I worked a missing child case that I am not going to describe in detail, out of respect for a family that has already had enough taken from them by people who thought they had a right to the story. What I will tell you is that I built a composite sketch from witness accounts, and that the composite was wrong in one measurement. The width of the jaw, narrower than it should have been, by what seemed at the time like an insignificant margin, and that the search teams spent the first 2 critical days looking for a face slightly different from the one that actually existed, following leads generated by a drawing I had made with my own trained hand. The case was never solved. I have never been able to prove that my error changed the outcome. I have also never once, in 11 years, been able to convince myself that it did not. I left forensic work not long after and moved south, and eventually I ended up in Adelaide, and eventually I opened a small seaside portrait studio, 2 streets back from Glenelg Beach, photographing families and children on the sand for a modest, ordinary living. The kind of work where the worst thing that can go wrong is bad light, or a toddler who will not stop crying. I told myself, taking that job, that I had chosen the safest possible use of my particular skill, that an eye trained to read a child's face for inconsistency would only ever be an asset in a business built around getting a good, honest photograph of a smiling kid on a beach. I believed that completely. I want you to understand how completely I believed it, because it matters for what came later. Glenelg is a beautiful stretch of coast, white sand, and a long jetty stretching out into water the color of pale glass. And in summer it fills with families from 6 in the morning until well after the light has gone soft and gold in the evening. I knew the history of the place the way anyone who works there long enough comes to know it, not as gossip so much as something the town itself carries quietly underneath its ordinary sunburned cheerfulness. In January of 1966, 3 siblings, 9, 7, and 4 years old, walked to that beach alone the way children did back then, and never came home. Witnesses that day described seeing them on the sand with a tall, fair-haired man. No trace of them was ever found, not then, not in the decades of searching since, and the case remains formally and completely unsolved. People who grow up near that beach do not talk about it as haunted, not in the way you would expect. They talk about it as watchful, as though the sand and the waters have spent every summer since quietly keeping account, waiting for something to come back into balance that never has. I did not think about any of that on the morning I want to tell you about. It was an ordinary Saturday in February, 18 months ago now, and I had 4 family bookings scheduled along the dune grass north of the jetty, the usual mix. Toddlers in sun hats, older siblings squinting against the glare, parents trying to get everyone looking in the same direction at the same time. The 4th booking of the day was a woman named Alana, alone with her daughter, a quiet dark-haired girl of about 7 who did not smile easily and did not need to, because she had the kind of naturally composed, watchful face that photographs beautifully without any effort at all. I remember the session being unremarkable in every way that matters. Alana was warm, easy to work with, the kind of client who trusts the photographer and gets out of the way. Her daughter sat where she was told, looked where she was told, and I moved through my usual sequence. Close portraits first while the light was still soft, then wider shots as the sun climbed, framing her against the dune grass with the pale water behind her. I shot perhaps 60 frames in 20 minutes. I remember nothing unusual happening. I remember thinking, packing up my gear, that it had been an easy, pleasant hour, the kind that reminds you why you chose this work in the first place. It was 3 nights later, editing the full set at my desk, after the shop had closed, that I found the frame. I want to describe this carefully, the way I was trained to describe anything unusual in a photograph, because precision is the only thing that has ever made me feel steady, and I am going to need that steadiness to get through this part. The frame in question was one of the wider shots, the girl standing in the dune grass with the beach and the pale water behind her, taken at what my camera's metadata told me was 11:14 in the morning. In every frame before it, and every frame after it, the beach behind her is exactly what you would expect on a busy Saturday. Families scattered across the sand, a dog, a cluster of teenagers near the water's edge. In this one frame, and only this one frame, there is a second child, standing roughly 30 feet behind Alana's daughter, close to the tide line, facing the camera directly. I did not recognize the second child from the session. I had not seen anyone matching that description on the beach that morning, and Alana had come alone, no other family with her, no other child anywhere near us. I told myself, the way I have told myself things my whole professional life, calmly, methodically, that a second family had simply wandered into the wider frame. For the fraction of a second, the shutter was open. An ordinary and completely explainable overlap, the kind of accidental background presence that happens on a public beach dozens of times a day. I made a note to myself, something practical and dismissive, background overlap, and I moved on to the next frame in the set. That was the warm part. I want you to notice how easily it arrived, how naturally my training reached for the harmless explanation before any other part of me had a chance to react. I have built an entire career on believing that instinct is trustworthy. It has never once occurred to me until that week that the very same instinct might also be the thing standing between me and what I actually needed to see. I came back to that frame 2 nights later, not because anything about it had continued to bother me consciously, but because a small, persistent professional itch kept pulling me toward it, the way an unfinished measurement always used to pull me back to a half-completed sketch. I zoomed in on the second child's face, purely out of habit, the same reflexive, close reading I have applied to thousands of faces in my career, and it was in that close reading that the geometry stopped making sense. The child's proportions did not match any age I could confidently place. The eyes sat wider apart than a child that height should carry, the jaw narrower than the rest of the face suggested it should be, a set of measurements that did not cohere the way a real face, any real face, always coheres, because a real face is a single unbroken structure, built by a single unbroken childhood, and this face read, to my trained eye, like several different ages, layered imperfectly over one another. The way a composite sketch reads, when a witness cannot settle on a single instant memory, and the artist is forced to average several conflicting descriptions into one uneasy face. I sat very still at my desk for a long time. My mouth had gone dry in the specific way it goes dry when the body has understood something before the mind is ready to follow, and I remember reaching for my glass of water, and finding my hand was not quite steady enough to lift it cleanly. I told myself, one more time, that it was a compression artifact, a common enough flaw in digital images shot in bright, high-contrast beach light. Faces at a distance sometimes soften and distort in ways that mimic real anomalies without meaning anything at all. I have explained away stranger things than that in 11 years of forensic work. I wrote the explanation down in my working notes, the same clinical shorthand I have always used to keep myself calm, likely compression artifact, distance and glare, and for a full day I actually believed I had closed the question. I went back to the full session the following evening and did what I should have done from the start, working backward and forward through every single frame from that morning, looking specifically for the second child. She does not appear in the frame before. She does not appear in the frame after. She exists in exactly one image for exactly 1/60th of a second, standing at the tide line, facing my camera directly, in a pose that a background wanderer, someone simply caught by accident, would have had no reason to hold. That was when I noticed the smaller detail, the one I still cannot fully explain, and the one that finally stopped me from being able to walk away from any of it. Behind the second child, at the very edge of the frame, half submerged in the shallow water, was a scattering of pale shapes I had assumed, on first glance, to be shells or foam. Enlarged, they resolved into something closer to fabric, a scrap of pale cloth, caught and released by the tide, the kind of ordinary debris that washes up on any beach on any given day. Except that when I cross-referenced the position against the beach's own historical markers, publicly available records any local can access, that precise stretch of sand, that exact distance from the jetty, is the same stretch where witnesses in 1966 reported having last seen 3 children before they were never seen again. I do not think I need to describe for you what that realization does to a person sitting alone in a photography studio at 11 o'clock at night. My vision narrowed at the edges, the way it used to narrow at particularly difficult crime scenes years ago, and I became aware of my own heartbeat before I had consciously registered being afraid, a slow, heavy thing arriving in my ears rather than my chest. I sat with my hand flat on the desk, feeling the small vibration of my own pulse against the wood. And I thought, absurdly, about whether I had locked the shop door on my way in that evening, a small domestic worry standing in for the much larger one I could not yet let myself hold directly. I want to tell you that I stopped there, that I closed the laptop and walked away and never looked at that photograph again. I did not. The same instinct that has always pulled me back to an unfinished measurement pulled me back to that face. And over the following week, working alone after the shop closed, I did the thing I had spent 11 years training myself never to do, without proper authority or proper cause. I began to reconstruct it, the way I once reconstructed the faces of missing children from fragments of memory and fear, measuring the second child's proportions against the last confirmed photographs of the 3 Beaumont children, the ones the whole country still keeps somewhere in its memory even now, 50 years on. I am not going to tell you what I found in that comparison, because I am not certain even now, 18 months later, that I want it to be true. What I will tell you is that the geometry lined up in a way that no compression artifact, no trick of glare, no accident of light has ever lined up for me in 11 years of doing this work, and that somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting alone with 3 photographs open side by side on my screen, I understood, not with the trained analytical part of my mind that had built my entire career, but somewhere lower, somewhere past explanation, exactly what I was looking at, and exactly why my particular eye, the one eye in the world trained to see a face the way I see faces, had been the one to find it. I closed the studio 11 days later. I told the landlord it was a personal decision, and I have not photographed a single child since, not out of superstition, though I understand if you assume that is the reason, but because I no longer trust myself to look at a child's face without my training reaching automatically for the deeper structure underneath it, and I no longer know what I might find there if I let myself keep looking the way I was trained to look. I still think, most nights, about the composite I got wrong 11 years before any of this happened. The jaw I measured too narrow. The 2 days the search spent looking in the wrong direction because of a small, honest, catastrophic error I made with my own trained hand. I used to believe that mistake was the worst thing my particular skill would ever cost me. I understand now that it was only ever a rehearsal for something the beach at Glen Elg had been waiting, patiently, for exactly the right eye to come along and finally see. I do not go back there. I have been told by people who still do that on quiet mornings before the crowds arrive, if you stand near the old jetty and look north along the tide line, the sand there still looks the way it must have looked that January morning in 1966. Undisturbed, ordinary, waiting for 3 children who went in for a swim and never came out of the water the way they went in. I believe them. I have simply decided I no longer need to see it for myself to know it is true. Some faces, once you have learned to read them properly, do not let you go back to seeing anything the easy way again. This story is about a woman who has spent her whole life believing that meaning is always there to be found, if only you are patient enough and careful enough to find it. It is about what happens when a code appears to want to be found back. Get comfortable. This one is going to ask you to sit with a lot of silence. I have spent my whole career believing that any pattern given enough time will eventually make itself known to the person patient enough to find it. I no longer believe patience is always a virtue. Sometimes it is only the shape of a door left open too long. I am a cryptanalyst and a linguist, trained originally for academic work and pulled sideways over the years into cold case consulting. The quiet, unpaid kind that people bring you when official channels have already given up and all that is left is a stubborn amateur researcher and a folder of documents nobody with real authority wants to look at anymore. I want to tell you, before anything else, exactly what kind of mind I have, because it matters for everything that follows. I have spent my whole career believing that meaning is not optional in language, that a sequence of letters arranged by a human hand is never truly random, that somewhere underneath every apparent tangle, there is a pattern waiting for someone patient enough to find it. That belief has been the whole architecture of my professional life. It has also, I understand now, been the exact shape of the door that lets something in that I have not yet found a way to close. You have likely heard some version of the Somerton Man case, even if you did not know its name. In December of 1948, an unidentified man was found dead on Somerton Beach here in Adelaide, dressed neatly, no identification anywhere on him. Every single label cut out of his clothing with what investigators believed was deliberate care. No cause of death was ever conclusively established. Weeks later, a scrap of paper was found sewn into a hidden pocket in his trousers, torn from the final page of a rare edition of Persian poetry, printed with 2 words in that language, tamam shud, meaning finished or ended. The book itself turned up eventually, discarded in the back seat of an unlocked car, and in its final pages, someone had written, by hand, in pencil, a short block of capital letters that has never, in over 70 years, been definitively decoded by anyone. I had known the bones of the case since university, the way most people in my field eventually come to know it. A kind of foundational text for anyone drawn to codes and unresolved meaning. I had never worked it directly until an amateur researcher named Colm, a retired schoolteacher who had spent almost 15 years quietly compiling every scrap of documentation the case had ever produced, reached out and asked, with the particular hopeful persistence of someone who has been told no by everyone more qualified than you, whether I would take a fresh pass at the code. I said yes for reasons I understood clearly at the time, and understand differently now. Colm's request came 4 years after the end of my formal career in this field, 4 years after I had staked my professional reputation on a code I believed I had broken embedded in a ransom note in an active missing person case. A solution I was so certain of that I convinced investigators to redirect resources based on my reading. And I was wrong, completely and provably wrong, in a way that cost that family critical days during the exact window when critical days mattered most. The case was never solved. My name was quietly removed from every future consultation list I had once been on. I have never stopped needing to prove, somewhere private and unspoken, that my instincts were right and only unlucky, that the failure lived in the case and not in me. And when Colm's email arrived, offering me a code that had defeated trained cryptographers for 70 years, some part of me recognized it immediately as exactly the kind of proof I had been waiting for, without admitting I was waiting. I set up in a small research office, 2 streets back from Somerton Beach. A space comb had rented cheaply for exactly this purpose, close enough that I could walk the actual sand where the man was found whenever I needed to clear my head. Though, in the months that followed, I came to understand that clearing my head and walking that beach had stopped somewhere along the way, being the same activity at all. The office was small and plain, a desk, 2 chairs, a wall comb had covered in 70 years of documentation, and I spent my first weeks there doing exactly the kind of methodical work I have always been good at, cataloging every previous attempted solution, every proposed cipher method, every linguist and mathematician and amateur enthusiast who had tried and failed before me, building a complete map of the problem before allowing myself to attempt any solution of my own. I want you to understand how disciplined that early work was, because it matters for how completely that discipline eventually dissolved. The code itself is short, 5 lines of capital letters, some crossed out, arranged in a pattern that resists every standard cipher approach, too short for reliable statistical analysis, too irregular for a simple substitution. And I spent my first month simply sitting with it the way you sit with a difficult piece of music before you try to play it, letting my eyes move across those letters at all hours, in daylight and lamplight, until the shapes of them had worn a groove into my thinking, the way a familiar road wears a groove into a driver's attention. It was in my 5th week that I began sleeping in the office rather than driving home, telling myself, reasonably, that late-night work suited this particular problem, that a code this stubborn deserved the kind of undivided, uninterrupted attention a proper night shift could give it. And I want to be honest that this explanation at the time felt completely sound to me. I have built a career on trusting my own reasoning. It did not occur to me in those early weeks that the reasoning itself might already be compromised by the very thing it was reasoning about. The first real break came, or seemed to come, on a night in my 6th week, close to 2 in the morning, working through a variant of a book cipher method I had not yet fully tested. And quite suddenly, the way these things sometimes arrive, not gradually but all at once, 3 of the 5 lines resolved into something that read unmistakably like a fragment of an address, an old street name in a suburb not far from where I was sitting. I remember the specific physical sensation of that moment, my whole body going very still and very warm at once, the particular euphoria of pattern recognition succeeding after sustained effort, a feeling I have chased, if I am honest, for most of my adult life, and I sat with that fragment glowing on my screen for a long time before I let myself trust it. Running the cipher method backward and forward, checking it against every letter in the original sequence, and it held. It genuinely held, the way a real solution holds, clean and internally consistent, in a way that random chance almost never produces. I did not call Colm that night. I told myself this was simple professional caution, that a partial solution needed further verification before I shared it, that I had learned the hard way 70 years ago, not to move too quickly on a code I had not fully proven. That was the warm part, the reasonable sounding shelter I built around a decision that was underneath the reasoning, something closer to hunger. I wanted to hold that discovery alone a little longer before I let anyone else touch it. Over the following 2 weeks, working nearly every night in that small office with the tide sounding faintly through the window, I extended the solution, one line at a time, each new fragment resolving with the same clean, satisfying consistency as the first, until I had, by my own methodology, decoded 4 of the 5 lines into a coherent message, an address, a time, and a phrase I will not repeat to you in full, because even now I am not entirely certain what it means, or whether meaning is the right word for what I found. It was on the night I began the 5th and final line that I first noticed something had shifted in the way I was working. I had always, in every previous project of my career, approached a code from the outside, applying method deliberately, testing hypotheses against evidence in the disciplined, external way I was trained to. Somewhere in those 2 weeks, without noticing the transition happening, I had stopped testing the code and started, instead, simply knowing what it would say next. The solutions arriving, not through deliberate cipher work, but through something that felt uncomfortably closer to intuition, as though I had stopped decoding an external message and started listening to something that had begun, very quietly, to speak directly to whatever part of my mind had always been listening for exactly this. I want to describe the specific unease of that realization carefully, because it is the part of this story I understand least and trust least in my own memory. I would sit at that desk at 2-3 in the morning, and the next fragment of the 5th line would simply arrive, complete, in my mind, before my pencil had finished forming the cipher key that was supposed to have produced it. And each time I told myself, calmly, professionally, that this was simply what expertise looks like after sustained immersion. That any sufficiently practiced mind begins to intuit patterns faster than it can consciously derive them. That this was a feature of skill rather than anything to be concerned about. I have built my whole life on believing that explanation. I built it that night too, and for a while it held me steady the way it has always held me steady. I stopped sleeping properly around the 7th week. Colm, on the rare occasions he visited the office, commented that I looked unwell, and I told him, truthfully as far as I understood it then, that I was simply close to finishing, that the final line was resolving faster than I had expected, and he took this as good news, the way anyone would, and left me to the work. It was on a night near the end of that 7th week, working alone with the office lamp the only light, and the tide outside, sounding louder than it should have at that hour, that I completed the 5th line, and read, for the first time in full, the message I had spent 7 weeks believing I was extracting from a dead man's 70-year-old code. I am not going to tell you the full message. I have thought about this decision carefully, and I have decided that some things, once spoken aloud, do not return to being merely words. And I am not willing to test that theory on you the way I was apparently willing to test it on myself. What I will tell you is that the message was not, in any sense a stranger encountering it fresh would recognize, actually about the Somerton man at all. It was, in ways I could not initially explain and eventually stopped trying to, about me, specific details of my own life, that no 70-year-old handwritten code sewn into a book of poetry could possibly have contained. Details about the case I lost, about the family I failed, about the exact private shape of the thing I had spent 4 years needing to prove, was not my fault. I sat with that completed decoding for a long time, the office silent except for the tide, and I understood with a clarity that arrived all at once, rather than gradually, that I had not spent 7 weeks breaking a code. I had spent 7 weeks writing one, out of my own need, my own hunger for exactly this kind of vindication, projecting meaning onto a sequence of letters, precisely random enough to bend toward whatever shape my mind was most desperate to find in it. That is the generous explanation, the one my training tells me is almost certainly correct. That the human mind, given a genuinely ambiguous pattern and sufficient motivation, will manufacture coherence out of noise with a confidence indistinguishable from the inside, from real discovery. I want that to be the whole explanation. I have tried in the months since to let it be the whole explanation, but I remember, with a specificity I cannot fully account for, under that generous reading, that in the final moments before I closed my notebook that night, I looked up from the page toward the office window, toward the dark stretch of Somerton Beach beyond it, and for one full second, no longer than that, I had the absolute, physical certainty that I was not alone in that room, not a sound, not a shape, nothing my trained eye could have documented as evidence, only the specific, unmistakable sensation of being read the way I had spent 7 weeks reading, as though whatever I had been listening to in that code had, in that final second, finished listening back. I closed the office the next morning. I told Colm the code had resisted every method I tried, that I did not believe it was solvable with current techniques, which was, in the narrowest technical sense, true, and I have not touched a cold case since, cryptographic or otherwise, though I still, some nights, catch myself looking too long at a string of numbers on a receipt, a license plate, the arrangement of books on a shelf, feeling the old familiar pull of a mind that has spent its whole life certain that pattern is never truly random, and understanding now, in a way I did not understand 7 months ago, that the pull itself may be the least trustworthy instrument I own. I have made my peace, as much peace as I am able to make, with never knowing what that man on the beach actually meant to write, or whether he meant anything at all, or whether the meaning I eventually found was ever really his to begin with. What I have not made peace with, what I still sit up with some nights, is the plain, unglamorous fact that my own mind, trained for over a decade to find significance in apparent chaos, was fully capable of building me an answer detailed enough, personal enough, patient enough to make me believe, for one full second, in an empty office at 3 in the morning, that something on the other side of that code had finally, after 74 years, decided to answer. This story is based on the real and still unsolved 1922 Hinterkaifeck murders in Bavaria, Germany. Despite renewed forensic investigation in the decades since, including DNA testing on exhumed remains, no one has ever been definitively identified as the killer. My name does not matter. What matters is the route, and the route was mine for 11 years. A stretch of muddy track through the Bavarian woods that no one else wanted, because it meant 6 miles on foot each way, and because it ended at a farm the other carriers had started calling cursed long before I understood why. I carried letters. That was the whole of my work. I was not a policeman, not a priest, not a man anyone asked to notice things. But I noticed things anyway, because the road gave me time to notice. and because noticing was the only company I had between one gate and the next. I want to tell you what I noticed, in the order that I noticed it, because I have spent every year since trying to arrange it into a shape that makes sense, and it never does. It only gets heavier. The farm was called Hinter Kaifek, which meant roughly behind Kaifek, because it sat past the last house of a hamlet too small to have its own church, alone at the end of a track through spruce trees that grew close enough to touch on both sides if you stretched out your arms, which I did once, as a boy, before I carried the mail, before I understood that some roads are better walked with your arms at your sides. 6 people lived there in March of 1922. Andreas Gruber, the old farmer, hard and closed-mouthed the way men get when a farm has taken most of what they had to give it. His wife, Kazilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, who had come back to the farm with a scandal trailing her that the whole hamlet knew and no one said aloud, and her 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy who was not yet 3, and a new maid, hired only days before, a young woman who had taken the position after the last maid quit without explanation, saying only that the house made sounds it should not make. I delivered to that gate every week for years. I knew the family the way a postman knows a family, which is to say, I knew their names on envelopes and the shape of Andreas Gruber's shoulders when he came to the door, and nothing else, and I told myself that was enough, because it was not my business to know more. I have had a great many years to regret that. The week before it happened, Andreas Gruber stopped me at the gate. He did not usually stop me. He took his letters and grunted and went back inside, and that was the whole of our conversation most weeks, for years. But that week he stood in the yard with his hands loose at his sides, and he asked me, without looking at me directly, whether I had seen anyone on the road. I told him no. It was the truth. I had seen no one, not for the whole length of the 6 miles, not that day or the day before. He told me there had been footprints, fresh ones, in the snow that had fallen 2 nights before, leading from the tree line up to the house. And here is the part I have turned over more times than I can count, comma by comma, the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the crack that will finally split it open. The footprints led to the house. They did not lead away. He told me a key had gone missing from the kitchen, the one that opened the attic door, and no one in the house would admit to taking it. He told me that in the days after, from the attic above the room where his family slept, he had heard footsteps, slow ones, deliberate ones, at an hour when every soul under that roof should have been in bed. I asked him if he wanted me to fetch the constable. He said no. He said it the way men said things in that country, in that year, meaning it was not a matter for outsiders, meaning he would handle it himself, meaning, though neither of us understood this yet, that he had perhaps 2 more days left to handle anything at all. I did not press him. I took my empty satchel, and I walked the 6 miles back the way I had come, and I told myself it was farm talk, an old man's nerves, nothing that concerned a postman. And I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because I have sat with it for over 100 years now, in the only way a dead man's mistakes are permitted to be sat with, which is to say endlessly, and without rest. I did not deliver to that gate again for 11 days. There was no post for the farm that week, and the week after was Holy Week, and my route was reassigned to cover a sick colleague's parish deliveries on the other side of the valley, a stroke of ordinary bad luck that I have never once been able to think of as ordinary since. When I finally returned to Hinterkaifeck on the last day of March, the yard was already full of men, neighbors, a local farmhand who had come, he said, to be paid, and had noticed the shutters closed at an hour they should have been open, and the animals hungry and unmilked in the barn, and had gone looking, and had found, in the hay barn nearest the house, a scene I will not describe to you in full, because you do not need the whole of it to understand the shape of what happened, only that it was all of them, all 6, arranged as though someone had walked them there, one at a time, and asked each to wait quietly for what was coming to the next. The instrument used was a mattock, a farm tool, the kind that hangs in every barn in that country, the kind I had seen leaning against that very barn wall a dozen times on my rounds, without once considering that a tool could be a warning. But it was not only the barn. When the men searched the house, they found the youngest maid, the new one, also dead, in her small room off the kitchen, killed separately from the others, on what the doctors would later determine was likely a different night entirely, which meant the killer had not come once, struck, and fled. The killer had come and struck and remained for days. The dishes in the kitchen had been used. The stove had been lit. Someone had fed the cattle in the days after the family stopped being able to feed them, because the cattle, when found, were hungry but alive, and cattle left entirely untended for a week in a Bavarian marked "do not stay alive on their own." Someone had stayed in that house, among the family they had just killed, eating their food, tending their animals, sleeping, perhaps, in their beds, for the better part of a week, before walking back out through the tree line and vanishing so completely that not one soul in that hamlet, not one relative, not one investigator, across a century of investigators, has ever been able to say with certainty who it was. I was asked to give a statement, because I was known to have spoken with Andreas Gruber only days before, and because the constable wanted to know what an old farmer might have said to his postman that he had not thought to say to anyone else. I told them about the footprints. I told them about the missing key. I told them about the sounds in the attic and the man's loose hands at his sides and his refusal to send for help. I did not tell them, because I did not yet understand it myself, that I had been the last outsider that farm ever tried to warn, and that I had walked away. The house stood empty after that, boarded and avoided, until it was finally torn down. Some years later, the stones scattered, the cellar filled in, as though the hamlet believed the ground itself might be made innocent again by erasing what had stood on it. I do not know if they were right to believe that. I have my doubts, comma by comma, the same doubts I have carried the whole distance of this telling. I still walk that road some nights, though I no longer carry a satchel, and no one waits at any gate for what I bring. The spruce trees have grown taller. The track has mostly gone back to the forest floor. But if you stand where the house once was, at the right hour, in the right season, when the light goes the particular gray it goes just before real dark, you will hear it, the thing the family heard in their last week above the ceiling of their own bedroom. Footsteps, slow ones, deliberate ones, coming from a floor that is no longer there, in an attic that no one has climbed to in over 100 years, because the house that held it is gone, and only the sound remains, patient, unhurried, still keeping the same slow pace. It kept on the last night anyone was left alive to hear it. I have asked myself, every year since, what I would do if that farmer stopped me at the gate again today, with his hands loose at his sides, asking if I had seen anyone on the road. I know the answer I would like to give. I have never been given the chance to give it. There is a sound a door makes when it looks shut but is not. 2 clicks, not 1. I have heard it enough times now that I do not need the light to know which door it came from. What I still do not know is who is testing it. This one is about a house that has been waiting a long time for somebody to listen properly. It is also about a woman who is very good at explaining things away, and how good she has gotten at it is going to matter more than she thinks. Get comfortable. I will take it slow. I have been the overnight caretaker at the Velisca house for 4 years now, and in that time I have learned to sleep through almost anything the building does. The furnace clicking on at 2 in the morning like a throat clearing itself. The upstairs floor settling under nobody's weight. A long groan that starts at the stairs and walks itself down the hallway. Guests always ask if I get scared, and I tell them the truth, which is that fear wears off the same way any job wears off, until you are just a person doing paperwork inside a place that used to be somebody's whole life, and then, in one night, was not. I came to the house the way most people who end up somewhere strange come to it, sideways, through a job I never planned on. Before this, I spent 6 years as a photography assistant on a small crime scene unit 2 counties over. The kind of work where you learn to look at a room the way most people never have to. You learn what belongs and what does not. You learn that the eye catches wrongness before the mind has a name for it, a coffee mug on the wrong side of a sink, a window unlatched that should be latched, a shoe by the door with the laces still tied, meaning somebody pulled it off in a hurry and never planned on being gone long. I was good at it. I was, if I am honest, proud of being good at it. The way you can be proud of a skill that cost you something you have not added up yet. I left that job 3 years ago, not long after my sister Josie died, and I have never told anyone the real reason, so I suppose I will tell it to you now, since you are already sitting in the dark, and I have nowhere else to put it. Josie called me the week before it happened, and said something was wrong. That she felt watched in her own apartment, that she had started sleeping with the lights on. I told her it was probably her upstairs neighbor's dog, the one that paced at all hours, and I told her to get a peephole camera and stop worrying. And I told her all of this with the same calm, trained certainty I used to bring to a crime scene, because that certainty had never once failed me before. 9 days later, she was gone, and the case was never explained the way anyone could live with, and I have spent 3 years turning that phone call over in my hands like a stone I cannot put down. So when the Velisca house needed a caretaker who could work alone overnight without flinching, somebody who had already spent years learning not to flinch, I suppose I was exactly the wrong person for the job, in exactly the way that made me perfect for it. The house sits at the end of a gravel road outside a town of a little over 1,000 people. White clapboard, 2 stories, a porch that still creaks on the 3rd step from the left, the way it must have creaked for the family who lived there. The Moores were killed in their beds on a June night in 1912, 8 people total, 2 adults and 6 children. And whoever did it covered every mirror in the house with cloth or clothing before they left, and left food untouched on the kitchen table, and was never caught, never even named with any confidence, not in over 100 years. That detail about the mirrors is the one people ask about most. Nobody has ever explained it. I used to have 3 theories. Now I do not have any. And I have stopped pretending that not having one is the same as being fine. On the Saturday I want to tell you about, there were no guests booked, an unusual thing for a summer weekend, a cancellation from a group that backed out at the last minute and left the whole house to me. I remember being glad of it, actually. I remember thinking I could finally do a full inventory of the upstairs without stepping around anyone's air mattress, and I remember taping a photograph of Josie and me, maybe 9 and 11 years old, inside the top drawer of the caretaker's desk in the office off the kitchen, the way I do every shift, so I can open the drawer for a receipt book or a flashlight and see her face for half a second without meaning to. That is the whole ritual. It takes 4 seconds. It is the only sanctuary I let myself have inside that house, and it has never once occurred to me to stop doing it. The corn outside was tall that week, taller than it gets most Junes, and it made the particular sound corn makes when the wind moves through it at night, a low continuous whisper with no words in it, like something breathing through its teeth, on the other side of a wall. I did my walkthrough at 10, checking the downstairs windows, the stove, the parlor, where the mirrors still hang covered with cloth as a kind of memorial, and everything was exactly where it should be. I noted it in the logbook the way I always do. Windows secure. Doors secure. Nothing out of place. It was on the second walkthrough, close to midnight, that I first heard it. The back bedroom upstairs, the one the 2 visiting Stillinger girls slept in that June, has a door with an old strike plate that has never sat quite right in its frame. Guests are told about it in the tour, a small piece of house trivia, the door that looks shut and is not. When you close it properly, it makes one clean sound, a single click, and settles flush. That night, standing at the top of the stairs with my flashlight pointed at the floor and not at anything in particular, I heard it close on its own, the way old houses do in wind, one click, ordinary, forgettable. And then, a half second later, from the same door, a second click. I stood very still. My mouth had gone dry in that specific way it does when the body understands something before the mind has caught up to it. A kind of chemical alertness with no name attached yet. And I told myself, calmly, professionally, that a settling latch will sometimes catch twice, the tongue finding the strike plate and then reseating itself under its own weight. I have heard old doors do stranger things than that. I wrote it in the logbook. Back bedroom door, double catch, likely strike plate wear. I even underlined likely, the way you underline a word you are trying to convince yourself of. That was the warm part, the part where the explanation arrives and the body starts to believe it might be allowed to relax. I want you to remember that I am good at that part. I have built a whole life on being good at that part. I went back downstairs and made tea and sat in the office with the logbook open, and for a while the house did what houses do, settled, ticked, breathed its slow cornfield breathing outside the windows, and I let myself half believe the night was over, in the way nights like that are usually over, with nothing, with silence, With a story you tell no one because there is no story to tell. I checked my phone. I thought, unrelated to anything, about my cat back at the apartment. Whether I had left enough food in the bowl or only looked like I had. And I sat with that small domestic worry for longer than it deserved, turning it over, doing the math on how many hours since I had filled it, glad, in a strange small way, to have something so ordinary to think about instead of the sound upstairs. I do not know how long I sat with the cat food in my mind instead of the door. Long enough that when I noticed I was doing it, I felt almost embarrassed, the way you feel catching yourself hiding. At a little after 1, I went back up to finish the inventory, because that is the job, and because some part of me, the trained part, wanted to look directly at the thing I had already explained away, the way you sometimes photograph a detail twice, just to be sure the first frame was not a trick of the light. The hallway upstairs was dark, the particular dark of a house, with no streetlight for a half-mile in any direction, and I stood at the top of the stairs with both bedroom doors in view, the back bedroom on my left, the front on my right, and I watched the back bedroom door for a full minute without moving, the way I used to hold a camera steady on a room I did not trust yet. It clicked shut again. One click, and then a half-second later, the second one exactly as before, except this time I was standing 8 feet away with no wind, no guest. No draft strong enough to move a door on its hinges, and no one else in the house at all. My vision did the thing it does under real pressure, narrowing at the edges, the way a photograph darkens toward its corners, and I felt my own pulse arrive in my hands before I understood I was afraid. A small tremor I could not still no matter how hard I flattened my palms against my thighs. I want to be honest with you here, because that is the only thing worth being in the dark. I did not run. I did not scream. I stood at the top of those stairs, and I did the thing I have always done, the thing that has never once failed me, and has cost me more than I can say. I built an explanation. I told myself the latch had simply worn further since my last walkthrough, that houses this old fail in small increments. No one notices until the increment becomes impossible to ignore. That 100 years of families and volunteers and paying guests, closing that same door, had finally worn the strike plate, past the point where it could hold on the first try. I told myself this while walking toward the door, my flashlight steady, my breath even. Every part of my training telling me to approach, document, confirm. I reached the door and opened it. The room was exactly as it should be. 2 small beds made up with period quilts, a washstand in the corner, the covered mirror on the far wall, its cloth undisturbed, hanging the way it has hung for years, the way it hung the night 8 people never got up again. I stood in the doorway with my flashlight moving slow across the room, cataloging, the way I once cataloged rooms for a living, looking for the wrong detail, the one thing that would not belong. I found it in the mirror. Not in what the mirror showed, because it showed nothing, covered as it has always been. I found it in the cloth itself, in a small handprint pressed into the fabric from behind, a shape no larger than a child's palm, faint, as though something had rested its hand flat against the glass from the far side, and pushed once, gently, testing what was there. I did not move for what felt like a long time. I remember thinking, with the strange sideways clarity fear sometimes gives you, that a handprint on cloth from behind the cloth made no sense, unless the cloth had been pressed from the wall side, which meant either the mirror had been taken down and rehung, which it had not, the screws were original and untouched, or something had reached it from a place a hand should not have been able to reach it from at all. The room went very quiet in the specific way that means something has stopped, rather than started. My legs had already turned me back toward the hallway before I had made any decision to move. The way your hand pulls back from heat before your mind has finished forming the word hot, and I found myself at the top of the stairs again, with no memory of the 4 steps it took to get there. The door closed behind me on its own. One click. I stood there in the dark hallway of a house where 8 people were killed in their sleep, and covered every mirror could not save them. And I waited, my whole body one long-held breath. For the second click I already knew was coming. It came. I do not have a better description for what happened in me in that half-second than to say I understood something I had spent 3 years refusing to understand, not with my mind, which has always been so good at getting in the way, but somewhere lower, somewhere that does not care what is likely. The second click is the sound of something testing whether a thing is truly closed. It is the sound of going back to check. It is the sound of someone who was not satisfied the first time, who needed to be sure, who could not simply trust that a door looked shut and move on. I have spent 3 years being the kind of person who hears one click and calls it enough. I do not know how long I stood in that hallway. I know that at some point I went back down to the office, and I sat with the logbook open in front of me. And I did not write anything, and I did not cry, though I wanted to, and instead I opened the top drawer and looked at the photograph of Josie and me taped inside it for longer than 4 seconds this time, for as long as I needed, which was longer than I expected. I still work there. I want you to understand that before I finish, 'cause it matters more than anything else I could tell you. I still take the Saturday shift, and I still do the walkthroughs, and I still hear, some nights and not others, that same door catch twice instead of once. And every single time, I make myself climb the stairs and stand in front of it and wait for the second click before I let myself walk away. I do not do it because I believe I will ever understand what happened in that house in 1912, or what happened to my sister 9 days after a phone call I answered with the wrong kind of certainty. I do it because somewhere in me, underneath all the training and all the calm professional explanations I have built my whole life out of, I finally understood what the house had been trying to tell me the first night. I heard it clearly enough to listen. A door that only clicks once has not really been checked at all. It has only been assumed shut by somebody who wanted very badly to stop looking. I checked twice now. Every door, every night, in that house, and in my own life, though I know, and I have made my peace with knowing that no amount of checking now will ever reach back far enough to answer for the one time I did not. There is a chair on a porch in Columbia County that has not moved in 11 years, and I am the only person alive who understands why it faces the way it does. I used to think the ground told the truth if you knew how to read it. I do not think that anymore. I think the ground only tells you what it has decided you are ready to hear. Good evening. If today asked more of you than you had to give, this is where you get some of it back. Nothing is required of you here except your attention, and even that can wander if it needs to. I am going to tell you something that happened in a town most maps no longer show. Let yourself go quiet, and let me carry this one for both of us. This is a story about the weight of a number on a page, and what it costs to be wrong about something you were paid to be certain of. It is quiet. It stays quiet the whole way through. Settle in, because we are going somewhere the maps stopped listing a long time ago. There is a way the ground looks when it has been burning underneath for longer than most of the people standing on it have been alive. It does not look dead. It looks tired, in the particular way a body looks tired after it has stopped fighting something and started simply enduring it. I have seen that ground more times than I can count, and I still remember the first time I drove into Columbia County for the Vance property, the way Route 61 narrowed and the guardrails gave out, and the state road signs stopped bothering to name what came next. I was 34 years old that autumn, 6 years into a job that mostly meant driving alone to places nobody else wanted to go. My title was Mine Subsidence Inspector, which sounded, to people at dinner parties, like something out of an old photograph. What it meant in practice was that I carried a thermal probe and a gas meter into crawl spaces and cellars, and told frightened homeowners whether the fire under Centralia had come close enough to their foundation to matter. People trusted the numbers I gave them, the way people trust a doctor reading an X-ray. They did not want my opinion. They wanted my instrument to say a clean, defensible thing, so they could go back to sleeping in their own beds. Corrine Vance had called the county 3 times that month, and the county, as it does, had passed her along to the state, and the state had sent me. She lived on the last inhabited street of a town that had officially stopped existing when the Postal Service revoked its zip code, a fact she mentioned to me on the phone with the flat pride of someone daring you to argue. Her house sat 2 lots from where St. Ignatius Church had once stood before it was taken down stone by stone and hauled away, leaving behind only a graveyard that the diocese still mowed twice a summer, though there was no longer a building to mow it for. I parked at the edge of what used to be a street, and was now mostly grass growing up through old curb lines, and I sat for a moment with the engine off, the way I always did before a call like this. The air smelled the way it always did there. A low mineral edge under everything, wet iron, and a burnt matchstick sharpness that thinned as you breathed it, but never quite left. Somewhere under my boots, coal had been burning for longer than my own mother had been alive, and I had learned to walk on ground like that, the way other people walk into a room with a sleeping baby in it, carefully, without assuming anything about what was safe, just because it looked still. Corine's porch faced the empty lot where the church had been, and on it sat a single folding lawn chair. Aluminum frame gone the color of a nickel, left too long in a pocket, its plastic webbing sun-bleached to the color of old bone. It was angled, I noticed, not toward the road or the door, but out at the empty field at a slight diagonal, as though someone had once sat in it to watch something specific happen, and had never bothered to move it since. I did not think much of it then. It looked like the kind of detail a place like that simply accumulated, the way a house accumulates dust in corners nobody sweeps. Corrine met me at the door before I knocked, a small woman with white hair, pinned back hard enough to look like discipline rather than vanity. And she looked at my equipment bag the way people look at something they have been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. "So," she said, "you are the one who is going to tell me whether I have to leave my own house." I told her I was going to tell her what the ground was doing, nothing more. and she gave a short laugh that had no humor in it and let me inside. The house was warmer than I expected. Low ceilings, and a kitchen that smelled like burnt sugar and coffee. And before I had my boots off, she had already poured me a cup without asking. It is a small thing, and I do not know why it has stayed with me the way it has. But I remember standing in that kitchen with the cup, warming my hands and thinking, briefly and completely without reason, that nothing bad could happen in a room that smelled like that. It was an accidental kindness, the kind you do not notice as a gift until much later. When the cold that follows makes you understand exactly what the warmth had been protecting you from. I began where I always began, in the crawl space, on my knees in the dirt beneath her kitchen, with the thermal probe in one hand and the gas meter clipped to my belt, reading numbers into a small recorder the way I had 1,000 times before. The readings came back clean, ambient temperature within range. No elevated carbon monoxide, ground settlement within the margin the state considered acceptable. I remember feeling, in that crawl space, the particular satisfaction of a number confirming what I already believed, which is a feeling I no longer trust the way I used to. It was on my second pass through the yard, checking the vent pipes near the property line, that the numbers stopped agreeing with themselves. A reading near the northeast corner came back 11 degrees warmer than the same spot had read 20 minutes earlier, which should not happen. Not in weather that had not changed, not in ground that does not move that fast. I checked the probe's calibration sticker out of habit, the small printed date I always glanced at without thinking, and found myself staring at it far longer than the moment required, running the numbers in my head twice, 3 times, the way a mind does when it wants very badly to be doing something other than what the data is asking it to do. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because the honest version is stranger than the version I would have preferred to tell. I found a reasonable explanation. Thermal drift, I told myself, an equipment fault. The probe's battery running low enough to skew a reading, and I logged it as an anomaly to be rechecked rather than a finding. It was, on its own, a small and defensible decision, exactly the kind of decision I had made 100 times before without consequence. It was also, I understand now, the same decision that had once cost a man named Frank Cisak his life, though I did not let myself think of him that afternoon. I had gotten very good by then at not letting myself think of him. Corrine watched me from the porch as I worked, that folding chair still angled toward the empty field beside her. And when I came to sit with her, a moment before starting the second round of readings, she told me, unprompted, that her husband had died 6 years before her call to the county, and that the chair had been his. He liked to sit out there in the evenings, she said, and watch the field where the church used to stand. And toward the end, he had started saying the fire was not really spreading anymore. It was collecting, the way a debt collects interest, whether or not you look at the statement. I asked her what she thought he meant by that, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pity. The particular pity of someone who has already lost an argument with the ground and knows you have not yet had the chance to. The light was starting to go by the time I returned to the northeast corner of the yard, and the second reading came back different from both the first two. Not just warmer, but shifted, as though the hot spot itself had moved 8 or 9 feet closer to the house since I had last checked it. I stood there longer than I should have, the recorder in my hand, telling myself the obvious things. Equipment drifts. Ground settles unevenly. There is no such thing as a hot spot that moves on its own in the space of an hour, and the fact that the numbers suggested otherwise meant the numbers were wrong, not the world. I noticed then, without meaning to, that the folding chair had turned, not far, perhaps 15 degrees from where it had sat that morning, no longer facing the empty field where the church had stood, but angled instead toward the exact corner of the yard where my readings had gone strange. And I told myself the wind had done it, though there had been no wind that day worth mentioning, and the chair's aluminum legs had not left a single new mark in the grass to suggest it had moved at all. That night I stayed in the only motel within 30 miles that still took state contracts, a low building with a parking lot that always smelled faintly of the same sulfur that lived in Corrine's yard. And I could not sleep. So, I lay there listening to a sound I could not place, a low settling groan somewhere beneath the floor that the desk clerk told me the next morning was normal. The ground always makes sounds around here. You get used to it. I found myself somewhere around 2 in the morning, thinking with strange intensity about whether I had left my truck's headlights on, a thought that had nothing to do with anything, that arrived and would not leave, circling and circling, until I finally got up and checked, and of course they were off. And of course that had never been the real question my mind was trying to ask. I want to tell you about Frank Cisak now, because I have never told anyone the whole of it, and because I think you deserve to understand what I already knew that night and refused to let myself remember. 7 years before Corinne Vance called the county, I inspected a house 2 miles from where hers now stands, belonging to a widower named Frank, who had lived on the edge of the exclusion zone since before it had a name. My readings that day were clean, the same kind of clean I found in Corrine's crawl space, and I wrote him a report that said, in the calm bureaucratic language the state requires, that his home showed no elevated risk of subsidence at that time. He thanked me. He made me coffee, the way Corrine had, in a kitchen that smelled almost exactly the same. And I remember thinking, driving away, that I had done my job well, that I had given a frightened old man a peaceful night's sleep, with nothing but a clean set of numbers. 4 months later, the ground opened beneath his kitchen floor while he slept in the next room. And by the time anyone found the smoke coming up through the new gap in his foundation, it was already too late to matter. The state's investigation found no fault in my methodology. The readings I had taken were accurate for the day I had taken them. Ground fire migration, the report concluded, is inherently unpredictable across time, and no inspector could reasonably be expected to account for changes that had not yet occurred. I was cleared of any error. I have never in 7 years believed that clearance was the same thing as innocence. I am telling you this now because I need you to understand what happened the following evening at Corinne Vance's house, when the ground beneath her porch gave a sound I recognized instantly and completely, a low collapsing groan I had heard exactly once before in my life. In a report I read about a kitchen floor in a house I had once called safe. I had gone back to finish the assessment, unable to leave the anomaly unresolved, unable to write the report I knew the state wanted, the clean one, the one that would let Corrine sleep through the winter. believing her house was fine. I was in the yard near dusk when I heard it, and I turned to see the ground beside the porch step had begun to slump, a slow visible sinking no wider than a doorway, steam rising thin and pale from a crack that had not existed that morning. And Corinne was already outside on the step, exactly where the ground was going, because she had heard the sound too, and had not understood what it meant. I did not think. I crossed the yard faster than I have ever moved in my life, and pulled her back by the arm as the step gave way beneath where she had been standing, the two of us landing hard on solid ground, 3 feet clear of a gap that had not existed 60 seconds earlier. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. The porch step was gone. In its place was a dark, breathing opening no larger than a dinner table, and from it came a smell I will never fully describe to anyone, wet iron and burnt matchstick sulfur, and underneath it, impossibly, something sweeter, like a struck match held too close to a candle that had just been blown out. It turned. That was all. Something in the dark beneath the step shifted its weight, and I heard it, and I stopped breathing. I do not know, and I have stopped trying to know, whether what moved beneath Corinne Vance's porch was fire, or ground, or something that had simply worn both of those things for so long, that the difference no longer mattered. I know that in the moment before I pulled her back, I had checked my meter, and the meter had read nothing wrong at all. Clean numbers on a clean screen, exactly as it had read for Frank Cisak 4 months before his kitchen floor opened beneath him. I know that for the first time in 7 years of trusting an instrument over my own instinct, I trusted the sound instead of the reading, and that choice, and not the number, was the only reason Corinne Vance is alive to tell you the rest of this herself, if you ever find her. The county filled the gap 2 days later, with engineered fill, and declared the property, once again within acceptable limits. Corinne did not leave. I asked her, before I drove away for the last time, why the chair on her porch always seemed to know before I did. And she told me something I have carried since. In the plain, unhurried way people speak when they have made their peace with something you have not. My husband put that chair there the week the church came down, she said, and it always points toward wherever the ground is going to go next. He never told anyone how he knew where to face it. He just knew, and I have stopped asking. Because some things tell you what they need to and no more. I do not work in Columbia County anymore. I moved out west to a state built on granite instead of coal, where the ground does not carry old debts the way it does back home, and where I sleep most nights without dreaming of kitchens or crawl spaces at all. But I keep, in the corner of my own porch, a folding chair I have never once sat in, angled slightly toward the edge of my own yard, and I could not tell you, if you asked me honestly, whether I placed it there out of habit, or superstition, or something closer to penance. I know only that I check the angle of it sometimes, without meaning to, the way you check on a debt you are certain, one day, someone is going to come to collect. I signed a report 7 years ago that told a man he was safe, and he believed me because that was my job, to be believed. I have never signed another report the same way since. I still write the clean language the state requires, the acceptable limits, the within normal range. But underneath every number I file now, there is a name only I can see, and a chair only I ever picture, and a debt I understand I will be paying quietly for the rest of my life.